Chapter 401. Night Order. Miss Wang Qi was not the kind of woman who panicked at the sight of blood. Though a merchant, she had indeed seen her fair share of it. After Lacroix pushed her through a side door into a residence and avoided the first round of bullets, she immediately stood up, found a window to observe the ongoing battle outside, and was ready to provide support at any moment. She was by no means defenseless. Miss Wang Qi had specifically taken time out to undergo 2 months of professional military training. While it didn't make her a qualified warrior, it at least taught her how to fire a gun. Beyond that, she possessed a skill far more powerful than the average warrior: wealth. Her 2 earrings, combined with rings on the pinky fingers of each hand, formed a miniature shield generator. At full power, it could provide 3 hours of protection and withstand the direct impact of 3 155mm howitzer shells. Shield generators were already exceedingly expensive, but the set Mrs. Wang Qi owned was many times more expensive than the usual kind. Typically, a shield generator device might be as large as a car, but this set was the epitome of miniaturization. Made of tiny items like earrings and rings, it could be worn with an evening gown to a banquet without looking out of place. Obviously, such a gadget was not something that could be mass-produced. In fact, it was a fine product crafted by a master forger using extremely high-end equipment over a long period of time. Moreover, a master jeweler had intricately designed it to ensure it remained beautiful, elegant, and high-class without compromising its functionality. Additionally, this miniaturized shield generator had a significant special effect: it would automatically engage when it detected an incoming threat, avoiding the situation where the user couldn't react swiftly enough to utilize the shield generator before being taken out. The most up-to-date novels are published on Fruit.no. From these aspects, one can imagine just how valuable this set of earrings and rings was. Moreover, from the inside of her evening gown's thigh slit, she pulled out a weapon that had been strapped there. It was a flintlock pistol, the ebony emitting a faint scent with openwork carvings filled with gold, showcasing exquisite craftsmanship. Rather than a weapon, it indeed appeared more like a retro craft. Stay tuned to Empire. In actuality, this ancient flintlock could be loaded with 4 bullets at a time. Regardless of the material of the bullets, the first 4 bullets fired each day would bear powerful spiritual energy and create a violent spirit explosion upon striking their targets, with the force of each spirit explosive bullet surpassing even that of heavy bombshells. However, she was not so arrogant as to believe these devices alone would allow her to survive this crisis. In reality, her entire set of gadgets was clearly designed with the core objective of defending against assassination. Mrs. Wang Qi had never placed herself in an absolutely dangerous situation. When the first wave of the assassin's attack was blocked by the shield generator and the spiritual energy flintlock gave her a means to counterattack, a brief delay would be enough for the elite bodyguards, who should always be close to her, to swiftly arrive and eliminate the threats. Under normal circumstances, that would be the case. But at this moment, it was clearly not a normal situation. What she was facing was not an assassination but a full-scale war. How mighty was the shield generator, anyway? It could stop 3 155mm howitzer shells, making it like a wall of size against assassinations, but in a war, a few machine guns and rifles could shatter it quickly with sustained fire. Not to mention, like the void shield, the shield generator was very insensitive to slow-moving objects. It wouldn't be broken by bullets, but it would be useless against someone approaching with a knife. In war, there are far too many things more dangerous than assassinations. And why had the situation on Heijian Star turned into a war? That story starts a few days ago. After leaving Rage Owl Star, Miss Wang Qi and her fleet traveled directly here. Heijian Star was still in the feudal era, with a population of 400 million people spread across dozens of feudal kingdoms. Among them, the 7 most powerful formed the King's Council, and every few years, they would elect one among them as the governor to handle communications with the imperial departments. From this perspective, the power of Heijian Star's governor was quite limited, with the role mainly serving as a liaison. Whether taxes could be fully collected depended on the cooperation of each kingdom. Of course, they usually cooperated. Those who didn't would be disciplined. Even the larger kingdoms didn't want to face the wrath of the empire and would comply due to the joint questioning of other nations. Certainly, many conspiracies and deceptions would arise around this mechanism. For example, the governor scheming against other kingdoms, or other kingdoms scheming against the current governor. But these affairs didn't concern Miss Wang Qi. With countless worlds within the empire, each with different levels of technology, economic foundations, and political ecosystems, who had the time to delve into so many? Wang's key concern was that most of the kingdoms on Heijian Star had very good relations with the Gu commercial firm, relations so strong that the Gu clan's family congress had been held on Heijian Star for the past several decades. The local 7 major kingdoms were quite welcoming of their arrival and fully supported the array of activities during the Gu family's grand meetings. Chapter 402. This time, as well, was no exception, at least it didn't start as one. The current governor of Heijian Star was King Ness Lumen of the Lumen Kingdom, the 3rd largest country on the planet. The location chosen for the meeting was also in the capital of this country, Pincer City. Pincer City was decked out in festive lights, treating the event as a grand festival. In the past few days, as the leading figures from the 14 major caravans of Gu's Commerce Association arrived one after another, a series of public and private banquets began. Wang Qi had been preparing for many years to vie for the position of family head and was now just a step away. Despite feeling the struggle from her late husband's cousin, who had been up to all kinds of maneuvers, even attempting to disrupt the pace by calling for an early family meeting. None of these had much significance. Before the official start of the family meeting, Wang Qi further consolidated her alliances through banquets and private conversations, reinforcing relationships with her allies. Out of the 14 major caravans, she still had a firm grip on 4, and another 4 were her staunch allies. By the time the assembly started and the voting commenced, she, holding 8 votes, could almost certainly elevate her son to the position of family head. Then, 2 days before the grand assembly, as a banquet was drawing to a close, the sound of thunderous gunfire and battle cries reached their ears. Wang Qi almost immediately realized that Gu Ming had been driven to a corner. Having been forewarned by her son, she had already been on guard against this issue. The standard security presence around her had tripled, all were highly vigilant. She reminded all caravan leaders to be aware of this issue and requested that they double their security force under the highest standards of safety. Additionally, the Chamber of Commerce fleet in the skies was always battle-ready to prevent sneak and surprise attacks. The expeditionary force provided by Gu Hang, through swaps of commercial goods, had moved to a small town on the outskirts of Pincer. Wang Qi did her best to hide their movements, but she also knew that a force of nearly 30,000 would struggle to go unnoticed. Exposure also had its advantages, creating a deterrent. I have an army outside, be cautious. So long as they did not come to blows, it was favorable. After all, if things continued normally, she was most likely the victor. But Gu Ming still made his move. Actually, Wang Qi couldn't comprehend it. Indeed, without making a move, he couldn't win. But what if he lost? The Gu family had suffered internal competition since its establishment, but in nearly 300 years, spanning 5 generations, it had never devolved into malignant, bloody conflict. While such incidents were not uncommon in other families, the Gu clan's internal struggles had never escalated to such a degree. Being more united than other merchant alliances was one of the reasons that the Gu clan had grown large. If Gu Ming lost, without any other deep-seated hatred between them and still being relatives, as the victor, Wang Qi had no need, and it was not likely, to thoroughly execute him. Upon meeting, they might even have to stage an act of familial unity as aunt and nephew. With such an outcome, Gu Ming could well live as a wealthy, idle gentleman. It was even unrealistic for Wang Qi to strip him of the Chamber of Commerce fleet under his control. Gu Ming could keep his influence, retreating to become a power within Gu's Commerce Association or, later on, continue to contend for the position of family head in the next cycle. But if he resorted to this, it would have been a bad precedent, a complete break from the rules. After such an incident, there would be no chance for amends. Gu Ming wouldn't be unaware of this. So, even up to the last moment, Wang Qi actually thought that while Gu Ming might stir trouble, the likelihood was genuinely small. But now that everything had happened, there was nothing else to say. The preparations made for defense were ready to be put into use. Continue your journey on Empire. The news of the battle's eruption was sent to the troops of Rage Owl Star stationed in the suburbs. Within the city, security measures from various families were urgently deployed and mobilized. Efforts were made to contact King Lumen, who was serving his term as the governor of Heijian Star, to have him take control of the capital's situation. At this stage, Wang Qi remained calm. While sitting in the banquet hall with her allies, she even had the leisure to perform a few lamentations, claiming that Gu Ming couldn't possibly do such a thing and must be under someone's deceitful influence, sighed that Gu Ming had lost his mind, and even discussed how to deal with the issue afterward. The situation outside was indeed starting to improve. The security measures were powerful and appropriate, and the surrounding area was tightly controlled, reports from the front indicated that the Lumen army had also entered the city, taking control of the entire situation, and the sounds of gunfire and shouting had died down. Later on, they discussed how to capture Gu Ming once the situation calmed down, to prevent him from escaping. But at this moment, the situation took a drastic turn for the worse in a very short period of time. The key factor was that the Lumen army, which was supposed to enter the city to pacify the chaos, lined up their formations towards the location of Wang Qi and her company, hoping to enter the area and take over the defense. They put it very nicely, saying that with the city's unstable condition, it was necessary to bring in stronger military forces for protection. But by this time, Lacroix, who had brought a special squad into Wang Qi's security team, expressed strong opposition. Wang Qi also kept vigilant and did not let them get close. Then, the Lumen army that came in full force launched an all-out attack on them. The productive forces of the Lumen kingdom remained at a feudal level, with poor industrialization and a main economic foundation relying on agriculture. But their army's weapons and equipment were not too shabby at all. They couldn't produce much, or rather, their production capacity was very weak and insufficient to independently support an army's weapons needs, but this did not prevent them from buying weapons. They had everything including the G5, G6 series of individual weapons, cannons, and so on. Of course, even with such equipment, the gap between them and the wealthy tycoons of Gu family's security teams was still significant. But the cannon, firing from a distance, was unreasonable. If it were only the threat of the artillery, that would still be manageable. Forming an elite force and breaking out to eliminate the artillery units was an option. Gu's security, almost entirely outfitted in alloy steel armor with laser guns, electromagnetic rifles, equipped with thermite bombs, plasma guns, and such, would have a hard time being stopped if a 100-strong team broke out. However, what was most unexpected was the deployment of Lumen Kingdom's true weapon of destruction: knights. In a feudal nation, there was, of course, a feudal system. The king granted lands to the lords granted lands to knights, forming the ruling class, the nobility. And one of the core conditions for those nobles to be granted land was that they must have their own mounts, mecha. On Hagian Star, there was a rather absurd scene. Serfs were using medieval farming techniques, cultivating diligently, working hard on their lands, and handing over 90% of their harvest to their lords, keeping only the bare minimum of food to survive, while the knight masters patrolled their fields in their mecha, ensuring the serfs were not slacking. When necessary, knights would heed the call of their lords, transforming serfs into militiamen and assembling under the lord's banner for battle. The lords would then answer the king's call, gathering their armies to fight under the king's flag. This was the system of the Lumen Kingdom, and also the entire Hagian Star. Those poor, low-ranking knights might have a family heirloom of the most common sentinel mecha passed down for generations. That thing didn't even count as a real knight's mecha in the empire's military hierarchy. But regardless, it was a mecha, with a height of about 3.5 meters, fully covered in metal, and its side-mounted twin machine guns had decent firepower and were impervious to gunfire. At least 200 such sentinel mecha appeared among King Lumen's army. And then there were 2 real knight mecha, or what could also be called knight titans. Ranger-class knight titan standing at 6 meters and 20 centimeters tall, with a quad-barreled heavy machine gun in the left hand, a gravity fist and grenade launcher in the right, and 16 enhanced range rockets on its back. This thing was truly frightening. The Knight Order of Lumen Kingdom posed the most serious threat. And it was exactly this Knight Order that nearly breached the defenses of Gu's security. Chapter 403. What is security for? To prevent assassinations, prevent riots, protect one's master. They might have better training than the military, better equipment, and are more professional in some missions to protect VIPs. However, when the situation escalates into large-scale warfare, differences in specialization, training methods, and weaponry become a vulnerability. Security forces lack heavy firepower and anti-armor capabilities. Facing artillery, they struggle to counter. Against the so-called Knight Order, those sentry mecha paired with 2 Ranger-class Knight Titans charging at them, they are at an overall disadvantage. Their numbers are far fewer than the opposing side. Under the onslaught of the enemy's vast expendable troops and withstanding artillery barrage, as well as targeted assaults by Knight Titans leading numerous sentry mecha, the defense line of Gu's security was continuously compressed and breached. The situation quickly became perilous. At this point, Wang Qi made a decision that she later regretted as possibly being a mistake, to hold their position. She hoped they could hold out until the Rage Owl Star Legion from the town outside the city came to their rescue. Moreover, they had contacted the Chamber of Commerce fleet in the sky to provide orbital support, deploy landing shuttles, and evacuate people from the air. But soon, bad news arrived from all sides. The Rage Owl Star Legion troops in the suburban town were also ambushed and were currently engaged in fierce combat. The Chamber of Commerce fleet in the space surrounding the planet had a rebellion. Among the 8 fleets under Wang Qi control, there were degrees of unrest, both large and small, within each fleet. The 4 fleets directly under her control were manageable, but the other 4, belonging to allied nature, had bigger problems. Moreover, the 4 armed merchant fleets under the control of Gu Ming were also threatening nearby, preventing them from taking control of the planet's orbit. Worth mentioning is that Heijian Star was not a place utterly devoid of anti-air capabilities. Going elsewhere might pose considerable problems, but in Pincer City, where conflicts had erupted, there was an expensive orbital defense system imported by the Lumen Kingdom. Unable to control the orbit for accurate orbital strikes, the few shuttles they forcefully dispatched, even if they passed the interference and interdiction from Gu Ming's ships, would get locked on by Pincer City's orbital defense system as they entered the atmosphere and then be annihilated in the sky. Reinforcements couldn't arrive, aerial evacuation was impossible, the Lumen Kingdom's Night Order was making rapid advances, and their defenses were shattered. At this point, Wang Qi realized that holding out was impossible, and they needed to break through. However, it was somewhat late to prepare for a breakout at this juncture. Even as they decided to break through, 3 sentry mecha as vanguards blasted open the gates and rushed into the banquet hall. Everything became incredibly chaotic. The 3 sentry mecha were eventually taken down, but how exactly they were finished off, Wang Qi wasn't clear. She only remembered, as she was fleeing with her bodyguard, the last glimpse she caught showed 3 wrecks. But the breakout was still not smooth, they were intercepted and attacked multiple times, and her bodyguards were sacrificed one by one. When they were almost at a dead end, when she was forced to use her last resort to survive, Lacroix, leading dozens of the 10th Special Warfare Brigade soldiers, arrived in the nick of time. About 500 men from the 10th Special Warfare Brigade were deployed and joined the expeditionary force. Their main force, along with the Legion, was in the town outside Pincer City. Only the 50 most elite, led by Lacroix, formed a team and entered Wang Qi Close Protection Unit. But from the beginning until the end, their role was not significant. They were more present as a communication channel between the security forces and the main Rage Owl Star forces in the suburbs. Fundamentally, they were outsiders, and followed a different path than the security team. On one hand, they were somewhat excluded as they were not subordinate to each other, and on the other, the special operatives like Lacroix were essentially soldiers, with protecting VIPs not being their specialty. But now, it was war. Read Exclusive Adventures at Empire. This fell within their area of expertise. Lacroix and his men wiped out the enemy forces entangling Wang Qi and then continued to protect her as they headed out of the city. Throughout this process, the enemy numbers were consistently substantial. They sacrificed one comrade after another, forcibly dividing their forces to distract the enemy's attention and managed to get through the ordeal time and time again. Until now, Lacroix, taking her with him, had reached the edge of the city. In an abandoned alleyway where they rested and briefly debated, Wang Qi, still not entirely safe herself, was thinking about how to rescue the leaders of the Chamber of Commerce fleet whose fate was unknown. As a result, not only did Lacroix completely reject her request, but they also encountered trouble again. Appearing outside the alley was a Kingdom Knight, a sentry mecha. Wang Qi was ready to assist at any moment. In her view, this young man named Lacroix, although skilled, was now alone. How could he contend with a steel machine? Not to mention, there were 7 fully armed soldiers beside the sentry mecha. During their previous breakout and escape journey, they had encountered sentry mecha as well. When faced with such situations, they would avoid them if possible, if not, they would typically divide their forces, letting another squad draw the target away, and then evacuate. Chapter 404. They had always been cautious not to engage with the sentinel mechas head-on. But now, there was no avoiding it. Wang Qi had also prepared to activate the final life-saving measure, planning to use her spiritual energy flintlock pistol which only had 4 uses to aid Lacroix in combat. However, this youth from Rage Owl Star, who had just claimed to only ensure her safety and not take her commands, left her agape with a series of maneuvers. Even within a narrow alley, his figure displayed extreme agility. How desperate would a scenario be where a sentinel mecha rapidly fires its twin-barrel machine gun down a cramped alleyway? But Lacroix had dodged it all. He practically ran up the walls, reaching over 2 meters high, akin to scaling rooftops. The Kingdom Knight followed him, firing, as bullets trailed his footsteps without a single one hitting. And even when the knight changed tactics, attempting to predict Lacroix's movements and using high firing speed to block all his potential escape routes, Lacroix still managed to evade in an inconceivable manner. Of course, what Lacroix did wasn't dodging bullets, he essentially anticipated and evaded before the machine gun could fire. And even if his physical strength and reaction speed were exaggerated, it would be impossible to dodge indefinitely. But just 2 or 3 seconds were enough. During this time, Lacroix also fired a burst of bullets from his grenade gun, accurately killing all the accompanying soldiers around the Sentinel mecha, and also striking its observation site. He had only fired about a dozen grenades, but with extremely precise shooting, he managed all this while employing serpentine evasion tactics. Even killing those 7 accompanying attendants didn't require 7 bullets, as 4 were enough by exploiting the grenade's micro-explosion characteristic, the remaining fired precisely at the Sentinel mecha's observation site. The structure of the Sentinel mecha's site was robust, but it couldn't withstand 10 precise, pinpoint shots. Its head, where eyes would be on a human, was blasted into a mess. Suddenly, the Sentinel mecha's attacks became chaotic and disorderly. The Kingdom Knight inside could no longer see outside. This left the operator inside awkwardly pulling at the levers. He could lift the faceplate of the Sentinel mecha. Despite it integrating a considerable portion of auxiliary systems and observation functions, now that it had been precisely destroyed, he had to abandon it. Afterwards, he could still fight using his own sight. But, he didn't dare. In the battle he had just experienced, he realized that he was facing an enemy with almost perfect precision in shooting. He had never seen anything like it in his life. It was no longer as simple as being a sharpshooter. He feared that once he lifted his helmet, a bullet from a grenade would hit his forehead. It would be the same fate as those who had fallen around him in 2 seconds. However, he wouldn't have to ponder this problem much longer. A moment later, an intense, scorching sensation pierced through his chest. Inside the cramped cockpit of the Sentinel mecha, the Kingdom Knight couldn't even bow his head to look at his wound. But he felt that his heart and left lung had been completely seared through. As the Sentinel mecha fell, Lacroix confirmed that it had completely lost its combat capability. Experience more content on Empire. He put the fully charged plasma pistol back into the holster on his leg, turned around, and found Wang Qi again. Shock was still evident on Wang Qi's face. Do all the soldiers under your governor have your kind of strength? Lacroix really thought about it for a moment, then said very strictly, not really. I was overthinking it. How could there really be so many warriors like you? But since you have the ability to eliminate a Sentinel mecha, why didn't you use it before? Because of the risk, Lacroix said, just now, any small mistake and I would have been the one to die. I don't mind death that much, but if I died, then the mission to protect you would have failed. So, unless it was a situation as dire as the one we faced just now, I didn't want to take the risk. I see. It's a pity for those warriors who were sent to distract the enemy. There's nothing to pity, it's their mission, Lacroix said. After thinking for a moment, he added, and you shouldn't act as if they have already sacrificed themselves, they are all elite warriors and not so easy to kill. Along the way, I left our special marks for them, and if they see them, they will follow us. I hope so. Despite saying that, Wang Qi didn't hold out much hope. Lacroix didn't say much more and just urged them to get on the road quickly. A battle had just erupted here, it was already unsafe. And then, a surprising scene unfolded before Wang Qi less than an hour later. Not only had Lacroix led her almost out of Pincer's urban area, but just as he said, those comrades of his had really tracked them down by the trail they left. A total of 50 people, and when they regrouped, there were still 42 left. Although they looked a bit ragged, they were able to carry out the mission to attract the enemy's attention, escape, and then make their way here, losing only 8 people. Moreover, based on their information exchange, they killed at least 200 enemy soldiers along the way. This performance was quite remarkable, and Wang Qi was somewhat numbed by it. She had thought that warriors like Lacroix were one of a kind, but to her surprise, even though his comrades weren't as formidable, they were still so strong. How could they not be strong? Those Lacroix chose to bring to her side were the most elite soldiers from the 10th Brigade. This meant that these soldiers were T2 level warriors trained in the army badge system by Gu Hang, who were eliminated in the final stages of the selection process for new starfighters. Each of them cost Gu Hang 11 points of grace and moreover, not everyone had the potential to be trained to this level. By comparison, Wang Qi's own well-paid and loyally cultivated security forces didn't fare well. They did not betray her, but they were almost entirely wiped out. In this situation, Wang Qi had no other thoughts, she simply followed Lacroix and the others and continued to break out. En route, they once again made contact with the command post of the Alliance Expeditionary Force and learned that a relief force had launched a sortie and was on the way. After some more time, they finally linked up with that force. It was a team from the 38th Mechanical Brigade. All 18 Lion tanks from the brigade had been deployed, along with over 100 armed personnel carriers and more than 2,000 mechanized or motorized infantry speeding their way there. After the forces converged, it wasn't until Wang Qi was within the protective embrace of the troops that she finally let her anxious heart settle back into her stomach. But then, she felt an oddly strange sensation. Looking around, everyone was a stranger. Among the people around her, she could say she recognized no one. These people were not her subordinates. Her needs would be catered to as much as possible, but in reality, none of them would directly obey her commands. These were the resources accumulated by her son, whom she had once despised as a good-for-nothing, and now, if she wanted to survive on this alien planet, she would have to rely on these people. However, besides feeling uncomfortable, she also inexplicably felt a sense of reassurance. This reassurance came from super warriors like Lacroix, from the outstanding individual strength of the special forces, from the steel monsters like the lion tanks and the armored personnel carriers. It came from her son. Chapter 405. General, is there any news of my aunt? The speaker was Wang Jiarong. The person referred to as the general was Prabhup. Generally speaking, Brigadier General is not recognized as part of the formal general officer sequence, being a transitional rank between field officers and general officers. Not to mention, Prabhup's Brigadier General rank came from the Planetary Defense Force's own system, which made it even less recognized. But who made Wang Jiarong dependent on this Brigadier General from her cousin's subordinate officers? Prabhup was also somewhat helpless. While the battle was in full swing, he still had to take calls from the starship every so often, being asked the same thing over and over again, and he was indeed getting a bit irritated. But he had no choice but to take the calls. He fully understood the anxious emotions of Wang Jiarong, who was on the starship, preparing to come down the next day to attend the Gu family's grand meeting. At this moment, he did have some news to share with Wang Jiarong. We have news of Miss Wang Qi. You've picked up my aunt. Yes, but there is both good news and bad news. Tell me both. We did successfully rendezvous with Miss Wang Qi as she evacuated the city. She is now under the army's protection and en route to our main position. That's great. What's the bad news? The bad news is, they were intercepted on their way back. Those 2 Ranger-class Night Titans that attacked us and posed a major threat to our main position, they ran into them. SSS. Well. This. Wang Jiarong suddenly panicked. Ranger-class Night Titans were not considered true Titans in the strict sense but were essentially combat mechas. Their stature had not yet reached 7 meters in height, and compared to the genuine divine machines the Titan mecha from the Mechanical Cult Guild, there was a gap. Within the hierarchy of the sect of mechanics, Titan mecha always remained the pinnacle force. The small ones were generally made by combining human body modifications and mechanical enhancements to create combat soldiers. The medium ones started with sentinel mechas and peaked with the Dominator class Knight mecha. And only the large ones could be called Titan mecha. Currently, in the Lumen Kingdom or the whole of Hagian Star for that matter, there likely did not exist any real Titan mecha, with the highest probably being only Knight mecha. But even a Ranger class Knight mech stood at an imposing height of 6.2 meters. For ordinary people, it was an absolute behemoth, which is why many commonly referred to it colloquially as Knight Titan. Wang Jiarong, an experienced businesswoman, knew well that the normal price for a Ranger-class Knight Titan was 700,000 tax currency. Similarly, she had seen the army of the Rage Owl Star. The so-called Mechanical Composite Brigade had decent equipment, but she likewise could estimate that such a brigade, with over 8,000 warriors including all their weapons and gear, would cost less than 350,000 tax currency in total. This meant that the price of one Ranger-class Knight Titan could be equivalent to 2 composite brigades. Not to mention, those 2 Ranger Knights wouldn't likely be operating alone, the number of troops accompanying them would not be small, and there would certainly also be a significant number of sentinel mechas. Such a force lying in wait on her aunt's return path. Wang Jiarong's mood was not yet one of despair, but it was inevitably tense and anxious. General Prabhup, please, you must rescue my aunt. Prabhup quickly replied, rest assured, she is the mother of the governor, how could we dare to be negligent? The moment there's news, I'll immediately relay it to you. Please do. After ending the call, worlds apart in the vast expanse of space, Prabhup put down the receiver and sought out his old partner. Like him, a veteran from the Wind Extinguishing Brigade, Colonel Jordan Leroy, who had previously served as the commissar of the 1st Extinguishing Wind Brigade, had been transferred with Prabhup into the Expeditionary Force, serving as its commissar. Finding his old friend, Prabhup said, now you must agree to another sortie. If anything even slightly goes wrong with Miss Wang Qi on her way back, we all deserve to die here. Leroy sighed. Other commissars usually pondered how to inspire morale, how to make soldiers and officers fight fearlessly, preferably not retreating a step in battle, fighting to the death. He, on the other hand, spent his days holding back their former brigade commander, now the army commander, urging him to think things through rather than acting recklessly. Sometimes, this difference made Leroy sigh. Addressing his old partner, Colonel Leroy said, let me correct you, I've never stopped you from taking the offensive. You are the army commander, the highest combat commander. What I've been stopping is your rash actions, not gathering enough intelligence before making decisions, not thinking things through. All right. Prabhup, who got a headache from the harangue, said, I've already made up my mind firmly, we must strike first. Leroy nodded, good, I agree. Explore hidden tales at Empire. The remnants of the 37th and 38th Brigades must all be deployed. Our armoured forces must come together and be used in unison. Leroy nodded again, good, I agree. I'll personally lead the main assault team. Good, I wait a second. Colonel Leroy, nearly letting the word slip automatically, quickly stopped himself, almost biting his tongue, you want to lead the team personally. Why? As the army commander, shouldn't you stay at the main position, securing it, rather than charging with the assault troops? Chapter 406. You've got to be kidding, the 37th and 38th Armoured Divisions are both mobilized, leaving only the 34th Division at the main position. Who do you think is the main force now? As the commander, I have to be where the main force is. He paused before continuing, moreover, the mission to rescue the governor's mother carries greater weight. With me present, decisions can be made on the spot without the need to relay messages back and forth. My presence also serves to boost the morale of the whole army, letting them know that an alliance general is never short on courage and is ready to fight alongside frontline officers. Leroy furrowed his brows tightly. He couldn't help but think, what Prabhup said seemed quite reasonable. He hesitated before saying, then if we head to oversee the strike team, what about the main position here? The 34th Division will be facing the enemy's main assault alone, which will be a lot of pressure. That's why, Prabhup stared at his old partner, you need to stay behind. What? Only if you stay here to hold the main position can I strike out with peace of mind. You make an awfully good point. And so it was settled, Prabhup acted with resolute and swift determination. The troops that needed to be mobilized were quickly assembled. It was no easy feat. At the moment, this so-called main position was just a small town. A few days earlier, when they had just disembarked from the starship, they were hiding inside a bunch of cargo containers, having arrived on site as goods. And when the time was ripe, they burst forth from their containers and headed to a residential area that the Gu family's local forces had long prepared. The area was cleared of its inhabitants, and the 30,000 men took it as their dwelling place. At that time, they could only carry some light weapons with them. The heavy firepower, be it artillery, armored vehicles, or tanks, was still packed as cargo in containers. The depot for their weapons and equipment was not too far from their barracks. In such circumstances, Prabhup and Leroy never took this operation as a mere trip. The guards at the container depot and the warehouse managers were all replaced by their own men. Moreover, they didn't just stay put in the residential area. They dispatched all the reconnaissance squads and platoons. Whether blending in with the townspeople or even roaming outside the town, it was crucial to control a large area. After all, they had clear communication with the Gu family regarding this operation. Were they afraid of being exposed? The family explicitly stated they were not afraid after all. Hiding 30,000 men armed with heavy weaponry was impossible. The only reason for concealment was so everyone could save face. So, safety was paramount, even if it was conspicuous. Prabhup and Leroy's caution as military commanders paid off in the events that followed. As soon as they detected a strange military force approaching, even before it showed any hostility, they went straight to full military mobilization. The alert warriors promptly took their battle stations. The forward sentries intercepted the unknown military force 10 kilometers away from the town. No matter the reason or argument the other side presented, they stood firm, refusing to let anyone through. As suspected, the intentions of this unfamiliar military force were not good. When they failed to negotiate their way into the town, they were the first to open fire. The expeditionary force from Rage Owl Star would not be trifled with. The reconnaissance squads and platoons engaged the enemy first. Even though they were initially armed only with light weapons, while the enemy had several mecha sentries, agile and powerful armored units, they faced them without fear. Enjoy more content from Empire. Under their layered resistance, the Lumen Kingdom's military advancement was slow. For the people of the Lumen Kingdom, what was even more terrifying was that even though they were the ones initiating the attack, it was the artillery of the Alliance Expeditionary Force that fired first. The power of the 155mm howitzer was so great that a single shot could destroy a Sentinel mecha. With 3 divisions, the Alliance brought nearly 350 heavy guns. 3 rounds of rapid fire battered the advancing Royal Army, which had no defensive fortifications to speak of, inflicting heavy casualties. The first wave of the failed assault caused the Lumen Kingdom's army to abandon their armor and retreat in disorder. After that, the 30,000 troops of the Expeditionary Force quickly occupied the entire town and began establishing their battle lines at every entrance and all positions around the town. By the time the Lumen Kingdom's army reorganized for a second assault, approaching cautiously, their target did not at all resemble a visiting force. Where the hell does a guest army, in half a day's time, turn an ordinary suburban town into a military fortress? Street barricades, the high points of occupied houses, windows, these things all became advantageous terrain for the defenders. Moreover, within the town, the Alliance's artillery spread out their positions, yet ensured the concentration of firepower to any exterior point. And to add to the embarrassment, the Kingdom's cannons weren't as fierce as the Alliance's. It's bad enough that their power was less, but their range was even shorter. When they drove oxen and horses forward, pulling the cannons into position and just firing 2 rounds, the Alliance Expeditionary Force's artillery quickly calculated their position and launched a counter-battery fire that nearly wiped out their gunners. And the Royal Army's gunners, their skills fell far short. The second wave took a long time to calculate the positions of the Alliance's guns and then discovered they were out of range, so they had to quietly push their artillery positions forward, only to be inexplicably spotted en route, and under another round of artillery fire, they were obliterated before firing a single shot. Lacking heavy artillery support, even with Sentinel mechas leading the way, the Lumen Kingdom's army couldn't breach the hedgehog-like town. Not to mention the threat posed by the Alliance's mortars, individual rocket launchers, and other anti-mecha weapons once they advanced. They failed in the second assault, and the third assault as well. Not until the Lumen Kingdom brought out their ultimate weapon, the Night Titans, did the tide of battle change. Those things were indeed fierce. The 2 Night Titans, with their long range, fired dozens of rockets into the town from tens of kilometers away, beyond the reach of the artillery. The effect was impressive. After firing 3 volleys and reloading, they began their advance on foot. Sentinel mechas closely followed at their sides, with infantry fodder a bit further in front. The 2 Night Titans, while firing suppressive rockets into the town, began to demonstrate the power of their rapid-fire cannons and laser cannons when they got within about 15 kilometers. One by one, houses were blown away and demolished. The Alliance Expeditionary Force indeed suffered significant casualties. Costing 700,000 tax currency each, the Night Titans, which equaled the cost of 2 combined Night units, certainly lived up to their reputation. But the Lumen Kingdom's attack was still repelled. At a distance of 15 kilometers, the previously somewhat silent Alliance artillery once again showed their might. This greatly surprised the Lumen Kingdom's nobility controlling the 2 Night Titans. The volley of long-range rockets they had fired earlier was aimed at the calculated positions of the Expeditionary Force's artillery. They had advanced the previous 5 kilometers uneventfully, without encountering any counter-fire from the Alliance, leading them to believe that the Alliance's artillery had been decimated. But at this moment, the Expeditionary Force clearly informed them, not only was the artillery unit not destroyed, but it also maintained strong combat capabilities. In half a minute, the 300 Alliance guns extravagantly fired 4 volleys in rapid succession, unleashing over 1,155mm howitzer rounds. The Lumen Kingdom's army was repelled once more. Chapter 407. For the army of the Lumen Kingdom, the deaths and injuries of the cannon fodder didn't matter much to the knightly lords. But the damage to the sentinel mechas was a different kind of pain. Death was one thing, but the destruction of a sentinel mecha under the feudal political system of the Lumen Kingdom was almost equivalent to the bankruptcy and demotion of a minor knightly family. Without a sentinel mecha, how could one call themselves a knight? In this assault on the town, there were only about 100 knights. Up to now, at least 20 sentinel mechas were lost. The remaining men suffered severe morale damage. Even the two Knight Titans began to consider retreat. The Ranger-class Knight Titans were equipped with shield generators, but the power wasn't particularly high. After all, with a height of 5 meters and 2, they couldn't afford to use miniaturized generators. If they used regular-sized ones, the load on the shield generator was also significant and hard to bear for the Ranger class. The intensity-reduced shield generators couldn't withstand too many rounds of shelling from 155mm howitzers. In fact, after these 4 rounds of bombardment, the shield generators of the two Knight Titans were extinguished. Up to this point, there was definitely no significant damage. In half an hour, if they didn't continue to be hit, the shield generators would start running again, or even now, they could force them to work in overload. At the same time, the Knight Titans themselves were durable enough to withstand a few hits from the cannons without much problem. They had the opportunity to charge during the gaps in the enemy's fire. The defensive positions built by the Alliance Expeditionary Force using street barricades and residential houses wouldn't possibly stop them. Wherever the rapid fire and laser cannons pointed, that position would blow to the skies. Their firepower was of a different concept altogether. But those two nobles from great families still retreated. What good would it do to annihilate those members of the expeditionary force? What if a Ranger-class Knight Titan was damaged in the process? Not to mention being damaged, but even overloading the shield generator, causing subsequent malfunctions, or if the mecha took a few hits and was damaged or even just lost some paint, that would be very distressing. The maintenance and repair costs for these behemoths were sky-high. If something went wrong with this big machine, even for great nobles, counts, marquises, or princes, none of that mattered. Realizing that the Alliance Expeditionary Force indeed had the ability to harm them, even though they knew charging ahead with resolve, having two Knight Titans penetrate the town would mean death to gods and Buddhas in their path, and following their breakthrough, the kingdom's army would likely secure victory. But in the end, they still chose to retreat. 700,000 tax currency, for a noble family, how many years would it take to save up? Moreover, if they lost the Knight Titan, they'd probably also lose their status as great nobles very soon, or at least be severely damaged. Under such circumstances, the chances of saving up that 700,000 tax currency might not even be there anymore. Plainly put, those piloting the Titans were from great noble families, not barefooted commoners. For them, warfare was a means to profit, a way to seek honors and achievements, not something into which they should throw their entire fortunes and even the life or death of their entire families. Why bother, then? With the two Knight Titans retreating, the pressure on the defense line of the Alliance Expeditionary Force also sharply decreased. When they had just emerged and demonstrated their power, Perbuff and Leroy, the seasoned partners, were indeed quite nervous. Though they were hastily repelled and didn't put up too much resistance, even so, the blow to the expeditionary force was not insignificant. At least 400 people were killed or injured because of those two machines. It was mainly due to a lack of experience and insufficient preparedness. Previously, the 32 rockets fired in a volley by these two war machines caught the Alliance artillery off guard, destroying over a dozen cannons and causing casualties to hundreds of artillerymen. Subsequently, the rapid-fire grenade launchers and laser cannons, in their charge, destroyed numerous positions and inflicted over 200 casualties. After suffering losses, they drew some lessons. For example, in situations where artillery might be threatened, transport trucks would always remain attached to the cannons. After several rounds of rapid firing, they would swiftly change positions. For example, within the environment of a small town, the artillerymen would do their best to add concealment and cover to their firing positions. For example, in the outer defense positions, the combat teams at each defensive point should reduce their numbers, but increase the number of defense emplacements. Under the premise of maintaining the density and layers of firepower, they dispersed their forces to avoid incurring heavy casualties when struck by enemy fire. These measures were all effective in reducing the threat posed by the two Knight Titans. But just this was not enough. Holding the main position was the most fundamental. Before this, they had already received news that the governor's mother was under attack, and Lacroix was escorting her to evacuate outside the city. Although they had repelled the enemy's attacks several times, whether it was Perbuff or Leroy, they both understood profoundly that the purpose of their mission, far from their homeland, was to ensure the safety of Miss Wang Qi. Merely repelling the enemy's attacks was insufficient. However, when those two Night Titans hastily ended their rampage, Perbuff and his companion keenly sensed the problem of these two most terrifying war machines having a very weak will to fight. This was a good opportunity. So, after a brief discussion, the two entrusted this important task to the 38th Brigade. They divided their main armored forces to execute a rapid assault. The reconnaissance soldiers scouting ahead located the positions of the two retreating Night Titans and clearly saw them being loaded with new long-range rockets, assisted by heavy engineering machines. It was hard not to see, searching for two 6-meter-tall behemoths with a telescope was easy. It seemed like they weren't planning on a continued frontal assault anymore, but instead, relying on the Titan's rockets, which had a range far exceeding that of the 155 mm howitzer, to bomb safely from a distance. But there wasn't much to fear. The Ranger-type Titan's rocket launchers were powerful, but they only had a 16-round capacity. Each loading was cumbersome, requiring engineering machines, making the rate of fire problematic. So, they would just have to withstand it for now. Meanwhile, the main force of the 38th Brigade, racing in their vehicles, quickly burst out of the town following the reconnaissance soldiers' information, choosing a path that avoided the Night Titans, successfully broke through, and met with Miss Wang Qi protected by Lacroix. On their way back, the two Night Titans, like mad, blocked the route of their return. This led to Perbuff deciding to lead the main force of the 37th Brigade, along with the remainder of the 38th Brigade troops, to go out and provide assistance. Discover more content at Empire. Chapter 408. Drex was certainly a great noble of the Lumen Kingdom. Throughout the kingdom, there were no more than 8 Ranger-class Night Titans in total. And his family owned one, personally piloted by him, an Earl. You can imagine the status that conferred. Therefore, he didn't want to risk his life needlessly. As an Earl of the Lumen Kingdom, after 20 years of accumulating wealth, the Drex family finally purchased a Ranger-class Night Titan 6 years ago. Since then, the path to skyrocketing through the ranks of nobility was laid out before them. Although they incurred a significant amount of debt to do so, and the king himself offered substantial support in purchasing the Night Titan, which meant they had to fight firmly for the king. But in reality, he still wasn't keen on gambling his life. Gamble what life? As long as he piloted this Ranger-class Titan, the Drex family's Earl status was incredibly secure and even presented the opportunity to vie for higher titles, more land, and more vassals in the future. Pay off the debts early, expand territory. But if this Night Titan was destroyed, then everything would be finished. Although he couldn't refuse the summoning of the king and he truly believed in the grand vision painted by King Lumen, they would give their full support to one faction in the struggle within the Gu family, an interstellar conglomerate, and should they succeed, massive benefits awaited. However, most of these benefits belonged to the king himself. King Lumen would be able to seize this opportunity to gain significant profits and even lead the nation to become the strongest on Hagian Star, potentially even abolishing the king's council to forever hold the governorship of Hagian Star in his own hands, thereby becoming king of the whole world. And him? As a loyal follower of King Lumen, he also rightfully expected his share of the spoils. A couple more Ranger Knights, a larger territory, more subjects, but that's about it. If there was an opportunity to gain more, that would be great, but first, he had to secure what he already held. To put it bluntly, even if King Lumen succeeded in the end, and Drex's Night Titan was damaged in the war, how much would the king remember their family's contribution? Could that remembrance produce another Ranger mecha? That was contingent on the king's conscience. And judging by what he knew of his own king, relying on his kindness and nostalgia was unrealistic. When the time came, King Lumen's likely attitude would be, I could use that money to rebuild your family, but it would be better spent courting other powerful families still intact. So what could the Drex family do then? Wouldn't they just have to swallow their broken teeth? Not wanting to end up in that situation was what Drex thought. The pilot of the other Ranger Knight involved in this battle seemed to share a similar sentiment. The two of them, understanding each other without speaking, made the same choice when they encountered difficulties. Explore stories on Empire. Originally, they planned to withdraw and reload their rocket ammunition before using their range advantage to bombard the enemy from a distance and be done with it. As long as they maintained the intensity of the military strike, they would have done their duty. After all, the cost of the rocket shells was reimbursed by the king. A charge into the fray? Let's see how it goes after the bombardment. However, communication from His Majesty the King arrived. The two were scolded mercilessly, and they received a royal command, demanding that they intercept the army that was retreating from the capital. According to His Majesty, there was a VIP within their ranks crucial to the success of their mission. They were to spare no expense in intercepting this force. And then there was the veiled threat. This is the time for you to demonstrate your loyalty to the kingdom. If you fail, I swear by the name of Lumen and the name of the king, you will pay the price. With those words, what else was there to say? Drex had little faith in King Lumen's promised compensation or rewards after the fact, but he believed that the punishment he mentioned would very likely be realized. Reluctantly, no matter how much resentment or complaints he had to take action together with the other Ranger Knight Titan operator. The two of them, leading the army, operated with rare efficiency, successfully located the retreating Rage Owl Star army on the outskirts of town, and intercepted them. This should have been an easy battle. Overall, their estimation of the so-called Alliance army was very high. The combat power of the regular soldiers was far superior to that of the Lumen Kingdom's conscripts by several grades. Hundreds of armored vehicles and 18 Lion tanks were formidable adversaries. But he also believed that, under their two Knight Titans, those tanks and armored vehicles were all like lambs to the slaughter. This was not an assault on an enemy's well-prepared fortifications that would be met with hundreds of guns at the ready. What they had to face were only tanks and armored vehicles, which posed a much smaller threat to Knight Titans in a field encounter. Sitting in the cockpit of the Ranger Knight Mecha, Drex fired the rocket launchers in rapid succession. The previously empty missile pods, not fully reloaded yet, combined with his colleagues, still amounted to 13 rockets fired with precision, causing considerable damage. Multiple troop carriers and armored vehicles were destroyed. With this one strike, the Alliance had already paid a substantial price. Regrettably, 2 rockets aimed at the tanks veered off target and failed to take down the Lion tanks. But then, they set their sights on those big targets. Their high-velocity grenade launchers and laser cannons began firing furiously. Under their onslaught, the Lion tanks, serving as the spearhead of the charge, were destroyed, 3 falling within just a few minutes. The Knight Titans kept firing while striding forward with giant steps, fiercely and overwhelmingly advancing towards the Alliance army. At the sides of the two Knight Titans, over 80 sentinel mechas and more than 20,000 conscripts were charging along. But the Alliance army, despite suffering significant losses, showed no intention of retreating. Their morale seemed hardly affected, and they proceeded to clash head-on with their adversaries. The Lion tanks, advancing in an assault formation, fired back fiercely. Heavy machine guns, reflector laser sub-cannons, magnetic rail main guns, when it came to firepower, the Lion tanks were equally formidable. At least destroying the sentinel mechas near the Knight Titans wasn't a big problem. Chapter 409 Hagian Star, capital Pansel city of the Lumen Kingdom, and the residents in the suburbs were both terrified and bewildered. The terror stemmed from the war, even though neither side deliberately targeted civilians and even took measures to protect them. This included the Alliance army from another planet that, after occupying the suburban towns, only took control of strategic areas, imposed military restrictions on the entire town, but did not harm civilians. However, war itself is the most destructive force, no matter from which angle you see it. Guns and cannons are blind, and the incidental damage leading to civilian deaths was beyond anyone's control. It was only natural for civilians to be afraid. As for the bewilderment, it was also easy to understand. Just a couple of days ago, everyone was busily preparing to celebrate the holiday with bright lights and decorations, and the arrival of the Gu family for their grand meeting was always a time of joy. Experience new stories on Empire. The last time they had come to the Lumen Kingdom was over 30 years ago, and in the memories of some of the elderly, it was a beautiful time. How could it suddenly turn into war just like that? And no matter how much they couldn't comprehend, war had broken out in a way that was unstoppable by the will of the people. They could only meet it all with a sense of terror and helplessness. Peasants on the hillside gazed at the battlefield set up in the plains below them. 2 armies clashed on the field. Terrifying war machines rolled over their farmland. One of them belonged to the traditional army of the Lumen Kingdom. 2 Knight Titans led over 80 sentinel mechas and 20,000 infantrymen, advancing in formation. The Luam infantrymen, in simple cloth uniforms and almost no protection, were ironically at the very front. They were ill-equipped but plentiful in number, essentially seen as cannon fodder. Of course, even cannon fodder had its value, even in death, it shouldn't be in vain. They maintained a relatively loose formation based on their training and could barely form small combat squads. This was mainly to avoid being wiped out in one fell swoop by a single artillery shell or a burst of machine gun fire. The rifles handed out to them came with not too much ammunition. The fact was, the survival time of these cannon fodder infantrymen on the battleground wasn't expected to be long, and allocating too much ammunition would be wasteful. Their task was to charge, draw fire, and try to deplete their ammo before dying, which would be considered as completing their mission. The sentinel mechas accompanying them were the main force. These machines, just over 3 meters tall, with twin-barreled miniguns, had enough firepower. They couldn't penetrate lion tanks, but the armor of Strider armored vehicles couldn't withstand the fierce barrage of the miniguns. Often, a few mechas could destroy an armored vehicle with a concentrated volley. The two more powerful Night Titans were outright behemoths of destruction. At the start of the battle, they had already destroyed 3 lion tanks. Yet, even after heavily striking the Alliance army, Count Drex, piloting one of the Night Titans, still had a tense expression. From his many years of war experience, the enemy had encountered their superior firepower head-on, sustaining such heavy casualties that their strongest warfare weapons, the lion tanks, had lost almost 20%. Logically, their morale should have been affected. But why was there no sign of faltering among these soldiers from another planet? Never mind the tanks and armored vehicles. In Count Drex's view, those manning powerful weaponry were generally elite, possessed higher morale, and were not easily shaken. That was somewhat understandable, but what about the infantrymen who were initially transported by trucks or infantry fighting vehicles and were now all alighting to fight on foot? Weren't they supposed to be cannon fodder as well? Why hadn't they faltered even once? On the contrary, what surprised Count Drex the most was the performance of these infantrymen in the Alliance army. There were merely about 2,000 of them, but facing an enemy 10 times their number, they didn't show the slightest hint of fear. They didn't cower behind armored vehicles or tanks, instead, they bravely moved forward, using their rifles with far greater accuracy than the Lumen infantrymen to eliminate their attackers. They operated effectively in squad formations, and their modified machine guns powerfully suppressed the advancement of the Lumen infantry. Wherever the machine guns swept over, the Lumen infantrymen had to stop. Either they were shot down directly, or they had to seek cover on the ground and wait for an opportunity to counterattack, but often, there was no opportunity. The only thing that could pause the firepower of these Alliance soldiers for a moment were the sentinel mechas themselves. The Knights were not so easily defeated by bullets. On the contrary, when they detected the source of the Alliance soldiers' firepower, they would often direct their miniguns there. The Alliance soldiers had extraordinary courage, but in the end, they were still flesh and blood. A volley of minigun fire could wipe out half a squad in an instant. But, there were only 80 sentinel mechas after all. Moreover, these infantrymen were not entirely without means to counter the sentinel mechas. On the contrary, having realized that the Lumen infantrymen were quite fragile and posed little threat, these soldiers began targeting the Knights. Squad-level fire, riddling with machine guns, rang against the surface armor of the sentinel mechas like hammering metal. They might not penetrate the armor, but under the assault of several machine guns, the sentinel mechas would still stagger, with their advance speed hindered. Chapter 410. And it was often at this time that individual rocket launchers would lock onto them. Yet, individual rocket launchers were still not enough to destroy a sentinel mecha. Drex saw one sentinel that had taken at least 4 rockets. It was scorched black, its left arm blown off, and its power system malfunctioned, but it still had one hand able to lift its remaining machine gun and attempt to fight back, trying to eliminate the several infantry squads that attacked it head-on. However, the sentinel, after killing fewer than 10 men, was met with the ultimate infantry destroyer. A battery of mortars was fired at it. In a short while, at least 4 mortar shells had exploded on it. At the same time, a mounted heavy machine gun on the ground, seemingly belonging to the enemy's company support fire, showered it with a dense barrage of heavy rounds. There were also the machine guns on the infantry fighting vehicles. Having endured such a degree of attack, the sentinel mecha could no longer withstand the onslaught and was destroyed. Drex had already reacted. He raised his left hand and fired several heavy grenades from the mount beneath his mechanical arm, destroying the fire support position composed of the enemy company's mortars and the fixed heavy machine gun. In addition, with a laser cannon shot, he blew up an accompanying infantry fighting vehicle. Yet, Drex was still bewildered. As he did all this, with a sweep of his gaze, he saw 2 more sentinel mechas destroyed in a similar fashion. Even more quickly. After all, the opposing army was not just made up of infantry. The Lion tanks also showed their power, with their magnetic rail main guns capable of blasting Sentinel mechas in one hit. Conversely, Sentinel mechas had no real means to deal with Lion tanks. By this time, he realized that the difference between Sentinel mechas and Lion tanks was too great. Although the cost of both might be similar, with Sentinel mechas being slightly cheaper and presumably in the same price range, their role on the battlefield was vastly different. Sentinel mechas at most are accompanying infantry equipment, anti-infantry units. They are agile, able to follow the infantry into cover, fight inside buildings. Their humanoid leg structure allows them to enter complex environments. That was their advantage. However, squaring off against Lion tanks on plains was overly foolish. They were large, had thick armor, and heavy cannons. Machine guns that could penetrate armored vehicles merely left dents on Lion tanks. Unless you concentrated fire and rapid-fired for a minute, enlarging the dent, causing metal fatigue, only then could you penetrate the armor. But that was very difficult, with the enemy's guns turning towards you, whether it was a laser auxiliary gun or a magnetic rail main gun, all were capable of a deadly single shot. 20 minutes into the battle, 15 Sentinel mechas had been blown up. This was a significant loss. These knights were also his people. They were his vassals and effectively his direct forces. These losses were all on his head. Drex was gradually seeing red. After quickly annihilating the main firepower of an infantry company, he turned his head to fight Lion tanks. He no longer hesitated or struggled. After sending a message through the comms for his companion to provide fire cover, he activated the auto-reloader to resupply his left arm's grenade launcher with ammunition as he strode forward. He set his sights on 3 Lion tanks advancing in a wedge formation and charging swiftly. These 3 had irked him for a while. Their magnetic rail guns and laser cannons kept bombarding him. His shield generator, which hadn't fully recovered to peak condition, although still faithfully blocking each barrage, ran the risk of being broken through if the bombardment continued unchecked. And those 3 Lion tanks were indeed a bit too close to him. Less than 2 kilometers away, with the Night Titan advancing with large strides and both sides heading towards each other, it took him 3 minutes to reach them. The 3 Lion tanks had realized the danger and moved apart, trying to make a detour. But what was their maneuverability compared to that of the Night Titan? Drex caught up with one, braving a round of firing while on the run, and with a powered punch from his right arm, smashed through the tank from above. The height of a Lion tank was about 3.5 meters, just over half the height of a Night Titan. After dispatching one, he quickly turned and rushed to the second, flipping the tank over with a powered punch to its side. Then it was the turn of the third. The whole process took just a few more minutes. Discover hidden stories at Empire. Drex felt incredibly exhilarated. By this time, his left arm's grenade launcher had also been reloaded. He looked up, searching for new targets with the visual information transmitted through the observation optics on the head of the Night Titan. But at this point, 2 things happened. Firstly, his comrade, the other Night Titan's pilot, sent him an anxious voice message. Prepare to retreat, another group holding the town has broken out, our rear guard hasn't held, and they have started to fall apart. Drex was quite displeased. So what? With the 2 of us together and unless facing concentrated artillery, what's there to fear? His Majesty has commanded us to win at all costs, don't tell me. Before he could finish, he felt a violent shake. This was the consequence of the second event that had occurred earlier. An infantry fighting vehicle had approached very close to him and deployed an infantry squad. Chapter 411. He did notice, but while communicating with his comrade, he got distracted and made a judgment that didn't seem wrong at the time, but in hindsight, it might have been a mistake. He had treated the armored vehicle as the primary target. A fragmentation grenade cannon blasted it to pieces. However, the infantry who snuck in were spread out and drawing closer to him. The gravity fist slammed down, and the infantry squad on the left was nearly instantaneously wiped out. The gravity fist wasn't only damaging upon direct hits. When it smashed into the ground, the dispersing gravitational waves and flying rocks were lethal to the infantry, making their alloy and plastic steel armor plates useless. Yet, a group of infantry made it close to his feet. Realizing something was wrong, he lifted his leg and stomped and kicked the men to death, one by one. However, they had already accomplished what they'd come to do. The equipment of the Night Titan included a shield generator. This device had one thing in common with the Void Shield: it couldn't recognize or block slow-moving objects. The approaching infantry, of course, counted as such. So did the bombs they stuck to it. Though just ordinary explosives, the blast at the knee joint of the Night Titan, akin to its knee, still had a very damaging impact. Continue reading at Empire. He wanted to retreat and get closer to another comrade but found that his movements were now somewhat limping. He hadn't lost complete mobility, but there was some issue with the power system in his left leg, causing an imbalance. This made him exceedingly alert. Then, he saw 3 more armored vehicles approaching. Having taken a lesson, he raised his arm to fire the fragmentation grenade cannon, preparing to blow up the 3 vehicles from afar. However, a flash of blue light appeared. A plasma-charged gunshot hit right at his already faulty left knee. His form suddenly tilted, and his left leg kneeled to the ground, causing his well-aimed fragmentation grenade cannon to miss its mark and fly off course. Lacroix, clinging to the top of the armored fighting vehicle, ray-sheathed the recharging plasma gun back into the thigh holster and then leapt down from the roof. After landing, he rolled a couple of times and then stood up, sprinting at full speed. With the help of his strong physical strength and the exoskeleton's enhancement, his short burst speed was even faster than the armored vehicle. An armored car exploded by the gravity fist of the Night Titan while covering for him. But this allowed Lacroix to enter the attack range. Reaching back, he drew the chainsaw sword he was carrying on his back while simultaneously closing in on the side of the Night Titan. Dodging the second punch, bracing against the push of the gravity waves, he grabbed onto the upper edge of the Night Titan's knee with one hand, powerfully climbed a few steps, and nimbly jumped onto its side and back. He initially wanted to attack the cockpit of the Night Titan, but it was not possible. The cockpit was the most protected part of the Night Titan, heavily shielded. Forget his chainsaw sword, even the thermite bomb he carried, the miniature version, might not be able to burn through the cockpit and kill the pilot inside. Therefore, he switched his target to the shield generator nearby. First, he stuck a thermite bomb on the back of the Night Titan's head and activated it. Then, with his chainsaw sword, he fiercely slashed at the weak point in the shield generator's structure. Bang! The shield generator exploded first, throwing Lacroix into the air. Following that, the thermite bomb detonated, burning away half of the Night Titan's head from behind. Tumbling through the air and flung over 20 meters, Lacroix barely managed to stand up and surveyed the results of the battle. The energy shield around the Night Titan had been extinguished, its head, which housed observation, calculation, and servo-cranial assistance, was destroyed. This formidable war machine, though not yet destroyed, was undoubtedly now like a lamb to the slaughter. Oh, perhaps likening it to an elephant waiting to be slaughtered is more apt. Chapter 412. With its leg broken, the integrated perception module in its head destroyed, and the shield generator demolished. This Night Titan was in a state of utter panic. Such panic was so evident that even an ordinary soldier could easily see it. Despite still possessing formidable weapons, it could no longer stand. However, the gravity fist could still obliterate any military unit in the Alliance army in one blow. The Titan was flailing about as if terrified something might approach. Its left hand, equipped with a grenade launcher, was also firing wildly in all directions. Yet, all its efforts were in vain. On the contrary, the Alliance army could now take its time with this Night Titan. Experience exclusive tales on Empire. It was like shooting a target. Without the energy shield, the armor of the Night Titan itself was still very strong, but it was much easier to deal with. Especially the magnetic rail main gun and the reflector laser cannon of the Lion tanks could inflict terrible damage. In just a few rounds, the immobilized and shieldless Night Titan suffered severe damage. The weapon systems mounted on both arms were offline. The gravity fist could no longer swing, and the grenade launcher was ruined. At this point, although the Night Titan was not completely destroyed, it was close to it. At least it was no longer a threat. Immobile and unable to attack or pose a threat, it was nothing more than a giant iron coffin with the driver, Count Drex, simply waiting to die inside. To completely destroy it, one would have to target the defense cores mixed with the pilot's cabin, the energy core and the power core, which seemed like a waste of firepower. After all, the warriors of the Alliance were still in a state of war. Since this Night Titan was no longer a threat, there was no need to bother with it for now. Besides, ignoring this mecha also had another advantage. The forces of the Lumen Kingdom were unwilling to leave this mecha here. Particularly many army officers and commanders were essentially vassals of the Drex family. With their lord trapped, of course, they had to come to the rescue. This created a local opportunity for besieging and interrupting reinforcements. Then, the enemy began to think about retreating. The remaining Night Titan didn't seem intent on rescuing its comrade, nor could it, as the immobilized Ranger Knight couldn't be dragged away unless they won the war and brought in engineering machinery to tow it. But the remaining Night Titan's driver, who was also the commander of the entire force, clearly had given up hope of victory. He had realized that their rear forces had been routed by the Alliance expeditionary force that emerged from the outskirts town. And at the front, he had seen Count Drex, who was once on an equal footing with him, being defeated outright. What was there left to fight for? If he were to end up like Drex, he'd rather face the king's punishment. He issued an order to retreat. However, he soon found that retreating seemed to be a luxury they couldn't afford. Perbuff led his forces westward. He directly commanded a force of over 10,000 men, all motorized or mechanized infantry. In terms of armored vehicles, they included 300 armored personnel carriers and 18 Lion tanks. This represented the entire strength of the 37th Division and a small part of the 38th Division. They swiftly overran the rear forces of the Lumen Kingdom. About 4,000 men had set up temporary defensive positions, originally to guard against the Alliance forces breaking out of the suburban towns. But without the knights presiding, these ordinary kingdom soldiers proved quite vulnerable. Under the full-speed assault of the armored forces, they collapsed immediately, serving no delaying purpose whatsoever. Afterward, Perbuff did not bother chasing these fleeing troops but led his forces in a mad rush towards the main battlefield. This battle must be fought well. Perbuff was already aware of the latest battle reports from the front. The 38th Division had already put up a good fight. Facing the enemy's fierce assault, the 38th, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, had managed not only to withstand the onslaught but, while protecting the governor's mother, had dragged the main force of the Lumen Kingdom into a quagmire. However, even though the 38th Division was fighting bravely, the disparity in numbers and equipment was a reality. Had it not been for Lacroix's extraordinary performance, taking out that Night Titan could have cost them far more and higher losses. Fortunately, the remaining Night Titan had lost its nerve. This was in line with a view that Perbuff had agreed upon with his military commissioner during their exchange of opinions. No matter how intimidating these forces of the Lumen Kingdom appeared to be, with their powerful mecha forces, at their core, they were an army from an old feudal system. The two of them didn't really think highly of such people. They were formidable only because of their two Night Titans, and were pretty useless otherwise. And those two Night Titans, with their feudal lord act, were impressive for sure, but Perbuff didn't hold them in high regard either. Indeed, the facts had proven so. The two Night Titans had failed to work together cohesively, and now, with one dead and the other fleeing, it was quite a laughable situation. Moreover, Perbuff had no intention of letting the one trying to flee get away. Perbuff's command style was always known for being brute and fierce, but in reality, he never considered himself reckless. Chapter 413. In the past, during the many battles on Rage Owl Star, his troops always held various advantages. Especially in the battle to recapture the eastern provinces, the Alliance's army was always superior in numbers and military equipment quality. So what's the point of strategy? Isn't it enough to properly allocate soldiers and then go into battle? But now, he needed to be patient. And he demonstrated such patience. Perbuff wanted to capture that Night Titan but didn't rush toward it. Based on previous battle reports, he had thought of some strategies. How did the last Night Titan fall? By becoming detached from its own army. Imagine, if at the feet of that Night Titan there had been a dozen sentry mecha, or a few hundred infantry right at its feet, and the Alliance soldiers who blew up its legs at the start, how could one get close? The Lacroix who charged alone later, even if they performed miraculously, couldn't withstand the firepower of the Night Titan and single-handedly take down a few hundred infantry and a dozen sentry mecha to directly threaten the Titan. Not to mention Lacroix, even an interstellar warrior squad would find it difficult to do so. You can't rely solely on brute force. Conversely, without the support of friendly forces, the Night Titan, no matter how strong, is only so much. No type of warfare weapon can operate completely outside of an entire military system. To capture this intact Night Titan, the first thing Perbuff had to do was to clip its wings. Under his command, the main force of the 37th Division's armored group, like a patient pack of wolves, pursued the retreating enemy. The firepower of the armored vehicles and tanks was mostly concentrated on the sentry mecha or, when the opportunity arose, bombarded the areas where the infantry were most dense. The foot soldiers who disembarked to fight also mainly targeted the ordinary Lumen soldiers. Retreating in the middle of a battle is actually a very challenging thing. If not handled properly, retreat could turn into an actual rout. Clearly, the soldiers of the Lumen Kingdom were not up to this challenge. Explore more stories at Empire. At first, they were barely able to maintain the order of the retreat, but as the armored units continued their pursuit, the morale of the Lumen soldiers quickly collapsed. Ha! Just as I expected. Perbuff grabbed the communicator and shouted, "Keep chasing them, rush them. Overrun these foot soldiers, overrun those sentry mecha. Ignore the runaways, but anyone who dares to get close to the Night Titan, hit them hard." He issued the orders. And his troops executed these instructions precisely. The remaining Night Titan quickly felt that it couldn't control the army anymore. The messages it sent either went unanswered or were responded to but couldn't be carried out. And the people around him were dwindling. The energy shield could protect himself but not the few ordinary warriors who still stood by him in the end. Even though, in this process, his grenade launcher continuously opened fire on the Alliance's armored units, destroying 4 Lion tanks and at least 20 armored vehicles. But at the same time, as the last Lumen soldier died at his feet, and the last sentry mecha was destroyed, the Night Titan became completely isolated. Afterwards, although its physical system, sensory units, and power system were all intact, it still ended up like a doomed elephant. Squads of infantry, covered by armored vehicles, rapidly approached. The Night Titan was in a panic. He saw what had happened to Drex before him, how could he not know what was coming next? He tried to avoid it, destroying several infantry carrying armored vehicles with his grenade launcher and constantly using his gravity fist and feet to strike and kick the approaching divided infantry. But the soldiers from Rage Owl Star one by one seemed not afraid to die. Even if the casualties caused by the Night Titan were gruesomely killed, that still didn't deter the soldiers from continuing to surge forward. At 6.2 meters tall, how could the Night Titan compare in agility to ordinary-sized infantry? With people all around him, even if he was moving non-stop like someone with ADHD, he still couldn't avoid being hit by rocket-propelled grenades that penetrated the energy shield at close range or having bombs attached to him. Soon, just like Drex, he lost his ability to move, then his shield generator was dismantled, and after that, he was completely destroyed. Inside Pincer City, the war gradually subsided. Ness Lumen and Guming, the two who could be considered the instigators of this incident, erupted into an argument. The dispute arose when Lumen told Guming that out of the 8 targets he had designated, 1 had been confirmed not to be on Hagian Star but aboard a starship in space that hadn't landed, 3 had died, and 3 had been taken captive alive. Guming retorted with a torrent of abuse. But the most important one got away. Guming said, his emotions clearly out of control, in your capital city. Amid the siege of your army. I even provided you with those security loopholes. I turned some of the key security squads for you. And yet, you let the person slip away. Such incompetence. No wonder under your leadership, even with my many years of covert support, the Lumen Kingdom can only be third-rate. It's all because of you. Waste. After a fierce scolding, Guming no longer had the gentle and tactful demeanor he had shown in past communications with Lumen. He truly lost his composure, the escape of Wang Qi sent him into panic. He had gone all in, and even if the plan had succeeded, killing or capturing everyone, the subsequent cleanup work would have been just as difficult. Not to mention Wang Qi wasn't dead. In his panic and helplessness, he lost his reason and verbally lashed out at his partner. Lumen, being a king, had never experienced such treatment in all his years. He was on the verge of exploding with anger. But in the end, he held back. He spoke with a stern face, the situation is not yet decided. The team that blocked Gu Hang has intercepted Wang Qi. I have given them a direct order to capture her at all costs, alive or dead. Hearing this, Gu Ming's mood calmed somewhat. He knew that among the troops blocking the small town outside, there were 2 Night Titans. That should be more than enough. His tone became more serene, that's good. Your Majesty Lumen, please forgive my earlier loss of composure. I take back what I said, and I truly apologize. Of course, Lumen wouldn't forget Guming's earlier insolence so readily. But it was far from the right time to turn on him, so he had to swallow his pride and put on a forced smile. However, just as he was about to make empty pleasantries, there was a knock at the door. Your Majesty, urgent military report. After listening to the report, Lumen had no time to comment before he heard a sharp crack behind him. Turning around, he saw Guming lose his composure again, smashing his cup forcefully on the ground. Meanwhile, in a town on the outskirts, another conversation was taking place. Miss Wang Qi, barely settling down from her ordeal, had to muster all her energy to make contact with various parties. She needed to establish contact with starships in space, actively looking for a chance to evacuate. But the situation was dire. 8 Chamber of Commerce fleets were still dealing with internal strife, 4 fleets loyal to Gu-ming were putting up a tough fight, the other 2 stayed neutral, helping neither side. With a serious threat from the planetary anti-air defense systems, it wasn't possible to secure the orbital space, which meant landing ships couldn't descend. She then turned to pressure the other 6 major powers of Hagian Star. There were some results in this regard. Lumen, as the current planetary governor, was essentially a rotational candidate put forth by the King's Council. Hagian Star wasn't under his sole dominion, and Lumen Kingdom's strength was only third on Hagian Star. There were 6 other major nations there, each comparable in size. These 6 nations were also baffled by Gu-ming's sudden actions. Though their current response was mostly promises to endeavor to mediate without any firm commitment of troops. But knowing that not the entire Hagian Star was against her was still good news. The third communication was with her son, using the Starfleet as a relay. In the communication, Gu Heng did not say much but comforted Wang Qi distress and called Perbuff and Leroy to join them. "You did well." Gu Heng began with praise, and then quickly passed on new orders. "Hold for 8 days. In 8 days, I will arrive." Chapter 414. On the day of the incident at Hagian Star, Gu Heng was already informed. He had also set up a star language tower, albeit with low power, sufficient only for interstellar phone calls, unlike some more impressive star language towers that could act like interstellar TV towers, capable of broadcasting across multiple star systems valuable for both political propaganda and cultural products. Gu Heng wished to build one of those in the future, but given their high costs and the fact that basic interstellar communication was now somewhat functional, the priority for constructing a bigger and better star language tower was not high. That day, he received a communication request from his cousin. She was on a starship, informing him of the changes on Hagian Star and the 14 merchant fleets from Gu commercial firm gathered in the Hagian Star system, facing internal strife and standoffs against each other. He immediately began to prepare. Firstly, military matters, where troops began to assemble on a large scale. On this front, things went smoothly. A few months ago, the main force of the alliance had fought a campaign to pacify the 3 provinces of the Eastern Province, led by Yan Fangxiu commanding the Central Group Army. Afterward, when the Eastern Province was stabilized and local militia and security forces were established, the main army corps returned and began to recuperate. The soldiers even received a fairly long period of vacation. Later, even with conflicts in the North Territory, the Central Group Army main force did not engage. The Northern Frontier Army Group was mostly formed with newly assembled units. Previous to this, the Central Group Army had already resumed training and ended most soldiers' holidays. At this moment, with the call to arms, the entire Central Group Army quickly completed pre-war preparations. The number of people Gu Heng intended to take was not very large, amounting to only about 35,000 spread among the 1st Brigade, the 2nd Division, the 13th Brigade, and the 36th Brigade. Among them, the most critical force was the Wind Extinguishing Brigade. This unit had gone through another round of restructuring. First off, the tank companies in the 5 composite camps received a full complement of Lion tanks, unlike other composite brigades which actually only had 2 tank companies. The 2 motorized infantry companies in each composite camp were entirely replaced with armored infantry companies. An additional tank battalion was also formed. Thus, the total strength of the Wind Extinguishing Brigade didn't increase much, still numbering over 8,000 people, but they possessed over 300 various armored vehicles and 75 Lion tanks. Adding the regular mechanical composite brigades of the 13th and 36th, there would be over 100 Lion tanks assembled. As for infantry, the 2nd Infantry Division had over 10,000 personnel. This was the composition of Gu Heng's 35,000-person force. In addition, there were over 100 Wind Falcon aircraft in the Air Force formation, and 15 interstellar warriors. The reason for the increase from the previous 12 was that 3 more previously trained warriors had completed the growth of all superhuman organs and achieved the qualified standards. It's not that he didn't want to bring more troops, but transport capacity had to be considered. Strictly speaking, Gu Heng did not have the means for interstellar troop deployment. Even including the Gu commercial firm, the situation was no different. Previously, when his mother left, she had left behind 2 ships in orbit around Rage Owl Star, but under the current circumstances, those 2 ships were of no use. This is where it's necessary to discuss the difference between a Chamber of Commerce fleet and a regular naval fleet. Or rather, the difference between civilian ships and warships. It's not just whether there are weapons on board, the construction costs of the two can differ by tenfold, or even dozens of times, for ships of the same size and specifications. A starship built as a warship varies greatly in hull strength, ship materials, the initial military-specific design and structure, and power. All these factors significantly impact the final combat effectiveness. The two ships Miss Wang Qi left in the Rage Owl star system could easily transport 30,000 people including equipment across a star system to Hajian star during peacetime. Continue reading at Empire. But now, with Hajian star blockaded and Wang Jiarong anxiously stamping her feet, she couldn't even send a ship capable of evacuating Wang Qi from the surface. Sending one recklessly could result in it being shot down during evacuation or blown up by interstellar interception, an unacceptable loss. The same principle applies to Gu Heng's troop deployment. While civilian ships can transport people and equipment, they are defenseless vessels when used as transports between starships and the planet's surface. During the descent process, losing one ship could mean the loss of hundreds to thousands of personnel and a large amount of equipment. Even estimating optimistically and considering Hajian Star's orbital defenses as the weakest sort, and treating the 4 merchant fleet squadrons loyal to Gu Ming as fools, a bathtub crossing the ocean operation would be fortunate to have half of the landing crafts make it safely to the ground. Could he tolerate nearly 10 to 20,000 casualties due to troop deployment issues? Such losses were unacceptable to Gu Heng. And here lies the value of warships. Warships, meant for naval battles, can dominate the control of the target star domain and suppress planetary orbital defenses. This makes the deployment of troops to the ground much safer. Even if troops must be deployed under the least favorable conditions, dealing with orbital defenses, military landing crafts equipped on warships have camouflage and energy shields for protection, tougher armor, and a much lower probability of loss. Chapter 415. Of course, let alone Gu Heng, even the Gu family doesn't own any warships. For those in business, maintaining their own warships is too expensive and unnecessary. With that money, it's better to operate armed merchant ships, not to engage in naval battles with other major forces. If there is a real need, it's wiser to seek the escort help of the Imperial Navy, which is definitely more cost-effective than maintaining their own warships. This is the merchant's way of thinking. But now, Gu Heng wanted the help of a military ship. What should he do? Above the orbit of Rage Owl Star, there really was one docked. The Blade Tiger. This starship, which had come to provide space support to Rage Owl Star in place of the Quintet, was now his hope. Of course, relying on this escort ship, it was impossible to break through the blockade of the 4 Chamber of Commerce fleets controlled by Gu Ming. Even with the addition of Blade Tiger, while it could bring significant help to the other 8 fleets of Wang Qi camp, this kind of help was not decisive. He also couldn't expect that with just this one escort ship, he could suppress the orbital air defense firepower of the capital of the Lumen Kingdom. It would be more likely with the Quintet. However, Gu Heng's goal in leveraging the Blade Tiger was not to defeat his enemy's star domain forces purely through military force, but to use the Imperial Navy as a cover. The Blade Tiger was a legitimate warship of the Imperial Navy. Heading to the Hajian star system, it could brazenly park itself in orbit around Hajian star, right in front of both parties. With the Blade Tiger not firing first, would Gu Ming's fleet or the orbital forces of the Lumen Kingdom dare to attack? Gu Heng judged that they would not. If they did so, that would be sheer madness. All that remained was the one issue, how to convince the Blade Tiger to willingly transport his troops to Hajian Star. As long as his army arrived there, saving his mother was the most basic goal. Gu Heng felt he could achieve even more. Gu Heng first communicated with the naval officers aboard Blade Tiger. Although Yelizaya was not the captain, clearly, she was the one calling the shots on that starship. However, she didn't dare to directly agree to Gu Heng's request. Personally, I would very much like to help you, and I don't believe that bunch would dare to strike at the Imperial Navy. But, precisely because we are the Imperial Navy, there are things I cannot do without higher-level authorization. These were Yelizaya's exact words. What level of authorization do you need? At least an order from General Tyler Mungs, the fleet commander of the Tianma fleet. Gu Heng recalled the situation of the Tianma fleet and this so-called General Tyler Mungs. The Tianma fleet was the main force of the Imperial Navy stationed in Tianma Star Sector, with a defensive area extending well beyond Tianma Star Sector, affecting the star domain defense tasks of at least 3 nearby star sectors. The fleet's commander was directly appointed by the Imperial Navy. That said, a good half of the Tianma fleet's long-term maintenance and construction costs come from the taxes of the Tianma Star sector. The political clout of the Tianma Star sector on this fleet goes without saying. The Fufana family, a naval legacy family native to the Tianma Star sector, took shape about 70 years ago. The General Fufana of that generation was appointed as the Tianma fleet commander, and during his service, he expanded his family significantly, gradually forming a clan. After the first generation General Fufana, his brother, his grandson, and great-grandson had all held the position, embedding the Fufana name firmly in the genes of the Tianma fleet. The last Fufana commander was Yelazia's grandfather, who retired 8 years ago. The Fufana family's influence within the Tianma fleet was profound. For 2/3 of the past 70 years, the fleet commander of the Tianma fleet bore the name Fufana. Many of the mid to senior fleet officers had been financially supported and promoted by his family. However, it was awkward that after Yelazia's grandfather's retirement, the family suddenly lacked a successor. Although their influence on the fleet remained strong, it was difficult for the family to produce someone with the sufficient qualifications and achievements to take on the role of fleet commander. Currently, the highest military rank within the family was held by one of Yelazia's uncles, who was merely a major general and seemed to have no chance of advancing further. This was not really a problem. The Tianma fleet had not been headed by a Fufana for 20 out of the last 70 years anyway. It was just a period of lying low, nothing serious. Moreover, within the family, there arose an unexpectedly rising new star Yelazia. With a decade more of growth, she might have the chance to take over. Thanks to Gu Hang's encouragement, she participated in and defeated that green Skin Orcs pirate fleet, which had added much to her luster. She was the person who enjoyed the greatest fruits of victory from that naval battle. From this perspective, the Fufana family should be willing to help him. This point could also be deduced from the tone of Yelazia's recent communication. Furthermore, the Fufana's relationship with the Gu family was good. Although this was a civil conflict within the Gu clan, they showed no particular bias, but choosing to back Wang Qi would undoubtedly further solidify the relationship between the two parties after victory. Discover hidden tales at Empire. And the current commander, General Tyler Mungs, although not a member of the Fufana family, also shared a close relationship with them. He was originally from the Tianma fleet, later transferred elsewhere to establish his reputation, and rose to the position of general before being reassigned back to the Tianma fleet. Upon his return, he knew that if he wanted to have a peaceful time as commander, he had to maintain a good relationship with the Fufanas. The Fufana family was not some tyrannical overlord. They showed considerable respect for Tyler Mungs. Seeing as their own family could not promote anyone to the position, it made sense to support the current commander and foster a good relationship. The cooperation between the two parties had been quite smooth over the past 8 years. Frankly, if the Fufana family, especially the former commander, who was also General Tyler Mungs' previous superior, General Fufana, were to mediate, this matter could likely be resolved. Gu Hang even discussed the issue with Yelazia once again, and in this more private conversation, the female brigadier promised Gu Hang that she would speak to her grandfather, the former Tianma fleet commander, General Fufana. But there was another individual whose attitude was very important, the Star Sector head, Mr. Paidesi. This person was the one who held the closest relationship with the Fufana family. After the second communication with Yelazia ended, Gu Hang thought for a moment and then made a call to Mr. Paidesi. Paidesi had, of course, learned of the incident at Hajian Star. With just a brief exchange with him, Gu Hang could roughly discern his stance. The Star Sector head clearly saw this as an opportunity. The political power in the Tianma Star Sector mainly consisted of a confrontation between two major camps, the native forces and the Star Sector government. The native forces referred to the Fatches family, who had controlled the positions of the planetary governors of 3 stars and had a history in the Tianma Star Sector of several thousand years. They had even inhabited the area before the Empire's annexation, and had deep-rooted control in the 3-star systems, Fatches number 1, number 2, and number 3. The Imperial Star Realm army stationed in the Tianma Star Sector also had significant ties with them. On the other hand, the Star Sector government camp was led by the Paidesi brothers, one of whom was the Star Sector head and the other the Flying Wing Star governor. Together with the Fufana family's navy and the Gu clan's Chamber of Commerce fleet, they formed an iron triangle that had oppressively contained the Fatches family for 20 years. However, in recent years, the Gu clan had been moving away from this iron triangle, aiming to expand their business beyond the Tianma Star Sector and showing a trend towards reconciliation with the Fatches family. This was the larger context behind Gu Hang's assignment as the governor of Rage Owl Star, a scheme played by head Pei Desi. But this move did not turn out as Pei Desi had wished, failing to firmly tie the Gu clan back to the Iron Triangle's position. On the contrary, Wang Qi was quite averse to it. Similarly, Gu Ming seized this opportunity and maintained a relatively good relationship with Pei Desi. Before Gu Hang made the interstellar call to Pei Desi, Gu Ming had also called him. Now, the situation was very delicate. Chapter 416. After ending the interstellar communication with Gu Hang, Mr. Pei Desi still had another line open. This was a connection with his younger brother, Pei Desi. His brother had listened to the entire conversation clearly as he had just spoken separately with an uncle-nephew pair from the Gu family. The Gu clan, who has always prided itself on unity, also has a day of internal strife. They're going to make me die of laughter. His frivolous younger brother spoke with unrestrained glee, obviously taking delight in their misfortune. Yet, this time Mr. Pei Desi did not scold him but couldn't help revealing a faint smile himself. Indeed, the unity of the Gu clan had crumbled. Did he still need to worry about the Gu clan leaving the Iron Triangle, breaking the alliance between them and the Fufana family? Not at all. Gu Ming had already expressed his loyalty to him, reaffirming their friendship multiple times. And that stubborn Wang Qi, her son, whom he had personally supported into the position of planetary governor of Rage Owl Star. Now, the young fellow had also clearly promised to stand firmly by his side in the future. All he had to do now was to choose the one more to his liking between the two of them. I suggest picking Gu Ming, Pei Desi said. Wang Qi is not easy to deal with. Even if her son agrees to all our conditions, it's very likely that Wang Qi will still be in power of the Gu family. She might not honor the conditions we agreed on so readily. Mr. Pei Desi disagreed with this. He countered, so you think Gu Ming is very reliable? A man who initiated a violent coup within the United Gu clan, do you think he will obediently follow our arrangements once he has power? When Pei Desi thought about it, indeed, that was true. Mr. Pei Desi spoke earnestly, don't treat everyone as fools, as mere tools. Overall, we have no means to check the power of the Gu family. Whether it's toward the Gu clan or the Fufana, we shouldn't see people as mere pawns. Our rise is supported by them, and in turn, they develop better with our assistance. Mutual benefit is the only way things can last. Pei Desi rolled his eyes, the same old lecture. Although he showed disdain and sometimes thought his older brother could be quite old-fashioned, Pei Desi had to admit that at least one point was correct, they indeed had no ability to control the Gu family. No matter who they supported, whoever ultimately won, as long as the Gu family didn't completely disintegrate, retaining half of its power, it was still the biggest chamber of commerce across several nearby star sectors. They didn't have to pay taxes to the star sector government, nor did they require any support from it. What method could there be? If they completely cut ties, the Gu clan would be uncomfortable, as their operations within the Tianma star sector would become inconvenient since their headquarters were on Flying Wing Star. But likewise, without the support of the Empire Commerce Guild, lacking financial backing, the star sector government would also suffer. Both sides benefited from cooperation and would be harmed by separation. What else could be done? They'd have to make do. Despite his irritation with the Gu clan, Pei Desi understood this principle. He quietly listened as his older brother continued speaking. The words that Mr. Pei Desi said to his younger brother were essentially his own thought process. Any condition that Gu Ming can agree to, Gu Hang can too, plus Gu Hang can do one more thing. We've asked the Gu family to draw a clear line with the Fatches family, and he can take definitive action, disband Blackbird Heavy Industries on Rage Owl Star. This will certainly deteriorate the relationship between the Gu family and the Fatches family greatly. Moreover, we also have to consider the cost of making a choice. If we help Gu Ming, Wang Qi, without support, will perish, but do we have a way to deal with Gu Hang? Those 8 Chamber of Commerce fleets that were allied with Wang Qi in the past, if pushed to Rage Owl Star, could support Wang Qi's son as the family head. Discover stories with Empire. Do we have to dispatch the Imperial Navy to help Gu Ming control the Chamber of Commerce fleet? Or should we send ground forces to Rage Owl Star to eradicate Gu Hang? That's all impossible. Neither the Imperial Navy nor the ground forces are completely under our command, and we can't possibly find a suitable reason to attack the Empire Commerce Guild and a planetary governor. By helping Gu Ming, indeed, we can achieve the goal of splitting the Gu family, but we'd only garner the friendliness of at most half of the Gu family, and we'd turn the other half, along with a planetary governor in the star sector, into enemies. It's not possible to form the most ideal situation where both sides would want to keep on good terms with us. What's more, the cost of helping him is so high. Conversely, by helping Gu Heng and Wang Qi, we'd have to do much less. Even though those two would be harder to control, and the power of the Gu family wouldn't be weakened too much, that mother and son, in fulfilling their promise, would have to stand in opposition to the Fatches family, and our goal would be achieved. Moreover, wouldn't they owe us a favor after a successful cooperation? This lays a better foundation for future cooperation. Listening to his older brother's lengthy explanations, Pei Desi pursed his lips and summed up, "So, you've ultimately decided to help that kid Gu Heng, right?" Mr. Pei Desi slightly smiled and said, "Roughly speaking, yes." "Fine then, do as you wish." Pei Desi yawned hugely and stood up, "I'm off then." Watching his younger brother leave, Mr. Pei Desi revealed a resigned smile. Chapter 417. He did not even open his mouth to mention his younger brother. In the past, he did not know how many times he had spoken, but it was all to no avail. His brother always maintained that careless demeanor. Alcohol, various forms of sex, all sorts of thrilling entertainment. Speaking too much was useless. His younger brother was no longer a child, and now he was even more esteemed as the governor of Flying Wing Star. How could he keep nagging? Gradually, he stopped talking so much. Most of the planet's administrative affairs were handled by him as the head of this star sector. It wasn't that he wanted to seize power. It was he who had originally pushed his brother up to replace himself in the position. On the contrary, he often thought that if Pei Desi could take on more responsibility and help him out a bit, he might be able to catch a break. But in the end, it was always I who shouldered it all alone. While his brother went out to enjoy life, he still had to work. Sighing, he thought over his phrasing and conducted interstellar communications with both the Fufana family and General Tyler Mungs. 7 standard Terra days later, on Hajian Star, outside the capital town Pincer of the Lumen Kingdom, the headquarters of the Alliance Expeditionary Force. Although it was called a headquarters, in truth, it was so dilapidated that it was barely functional. Practicality was the only concern, aesthetics were the least of anyone's worries. Originally, this place was just a basement, which was then reinforced by sappers to prevent it from being bombed into collapse. These strengthening structures were very crudely done, as the sappers had a heavy workload and simply had no time for any design work. Their priority was to avoid collapse. Perbuff and Leroy were here, commanding their troops, and they had withstood a joint assault by the Lumen Army and a part of Gu's security forces led by Gu Ming. They had held out for a full 7 days. At this moment, neither of them had any semblance of proper appearance left. Dried sweat mixed with mud and bloodstains marred their faces and clothing. With no conditions for bathing or changing clothes, they continuously sweated, their bodies reeking. But no one minded. Everyone was in the same state. Hair disheveled, beards ragged, faces smeared with dirt, bodies drenched in sweat and the stench of blood. That was the appearance of every Rage Owl Star person holding their ground here. The two of them were merely particularly worse for wear, with the added special feature of dark circles and bloodshot eyes. These past few days, they had probably slept for only about 2 hours each day. They were certainly tired, however, they still struggled to persevere. They were all too aware that this war was incredibly tough. They had no reinforcements, no supplies, they had to rely entirely on their current strength and stubbornly hold out for 8 days. During this time, the two partners made some estimates about the enemy numbers. King Ness of Lumen had amassed an army of over 100,000 men on the battlefield, 2 Ranger-type Night Titans, and more than 300 Sentinel mechas. In these 7 days, his forces had probably eliminated at least 30,000 enemy soldiers, but the number of enemies seemed like it had never decreased. Those enemies were assaulting them nearly every moment of the past 7 days, regardless of day or night, whether it was clear or raining. Perbuff always used a scornful tone to belittle the soldiers of the Lumen Kingdom while boosting the morale of his troops. Carrying useless junk, cannon fodder treated worse than animals, purely coming to die, lacking discipline, weak will to fight, pathetic combat level. Continue your adventure at Empire. But what he said was also true. That was the level of Lumen Kingdom's conscripted soldiers. Especially with continuous attacks and heavy casualties, these conscripts felt that attacking the fortified town was purely suicidal, and their morale was so low that during assaults, should they suffer even minor losses without knights to back them up, they would quickly collapse. But the problem was, there were many knights. If it were just the 100,000 Lumen cannon fodder, Perbuff wouldn't care at all. However, the Royal Knights of Lumen put a lot of pressure on them. Especially those two Night Titans. When those two Night Titans bombarded from a distance, the Alliance army had very limited countermeasures and were essentially forced to endure the bombing. And when those two Titans personally led the charge into frontline combat, that was a nightmare. Having learned from the previous destruction of two Night Titans, Lumen's military would definitely not allow their Titans to be isolated again. Ordinary Lumen infantry was unreliable, but those Sentinel Knights were sufficiently tenacious in combat. They would adamantly protect the feet of the Night Titans, offering no opportunity to the Alliance soldiers. As a result, every attack led by the Night Titans was a nightmare, each time requiring the Alliance expeditionary force to pay a heavy price. They had to concentrate heavy artillery for bombardment, risk soldiers launching attacks, and after expending a significant amount of ammunition and even the lives of a great number of soldiers, they could only temporarily overload the enemy's energy shields. However, at such times, the enemy would often retreat, giving no chance to press the advantage. After 2 days, once the shield system was recharged, they would return to the front line. The Lumen military was becoming more patient. They knew that those entrenched in the town could fight, but they had no replenishments, no reserves. In a war of attrition, with an entire kingdom as their support, they were the ones destined to emerge victorious in the end. Yet, despite such dire circumstances, Perbuff refused to passively defend to the bitter end. He still insisted on implementing what he called a flexible defense strategy. Chapter 418. 3 days ago, during a full-scale enemy offensive, he risked an ambush by having his armored forces, camouflaged behind some ruined buildings and with artillery support, plus Lacroix Special Squad, suddenly strike. They successfully destroyed a Night Titan's shield generator, but at the cost of 6 Lion tanks, 30 armored personnel carriers, and over 200 soldiers. Moreover, due to the high losses, despite having created an opportunity, they were unable to deliver the final blow and had to watch the shieldless Night Titan successfully retreat. Still, the results of the battle could be considered acceptable. The Night Titan had sustained some damage, and afterwards, it didn't dare to appear on the front line, only able to fire missiles from the rear. Henceforth, only facing the onslaught of one Night Titan, the pressure was greatly reduced. However, after fighting like this for 7 days, they had nearly reached the end of their resources. Report to the commander, comrade, the enemy's attack has been repelled. Report the casualties. Yes. Company May 2nd, 37 from the south is gone, and when Troop 3 went to assist, they didn't find anyone alive. Troop 3 itself is now down to only 17 men. As previously requested by the political commissar, their designation has been preserved, and command integrated into the battalion headquarters. Currently, the 37th Brigade no longer has any companies intact, all have been placed under battalion-level command. The Sapper Battalion, Logistic Support Battalion, all have been committed. The main body of the 34th Division holding the eastern and northern fronts has suffered severe damage, acting Division Commander Major Gaius has fallen. Major Mive has taken over the command, and he already is the 3rd acting Division Commander for the 34th. Perbuff listened with an expressionless face. Apart from the enemy being repelled, there was no good news in the other reports. But his heart had already become somewhat numb. It had been like this all along, especially in the last 2 days, always this kind of news. They had repelled the enemy's attacks time and again, contesting every house and even every piece of rubble with the enemy. Now, they were truly close to the brink. The 30,000-strong force he had brought with him, it's possible less than 13,000 were still alive now, and most had injuries. Although the loss of personnel was devastating, the situation in other areas was even worse. Out of a total of 36 Lion tanks from 2 combined brigades, only the last one was operational. Out of a total of 400 artillery pieces, 320 had already been destroyed. Even with the remaining 80, considering the current artillery shell inventory, they could fire at most 6 more rounds. There were less than 1,000 rounds of artillery shells left. All the rocket launchers had been used up, mortar shells were also running low, and even bullets had to be carefully collected from the bodies of fallen soldiers in order to keep going. It could be said that, apart from food reserves which were still plentiful temporarily because they had driven away the suburban townsfolk and left behind all the food, all other war materials had reached their last critical stage. Yet, it was only the 7th day. 1 day short of the 8 days the governor had asked for. What to do? Perbuff didn't know either. Seizing the momentary lull in battle, he left the command post. Leroy didn't try to stop him, the political commissar was already lying down asleep. One of his ears had gone deaf, and he also hadn't slept for 23 hours. He needed to rest for a while. Once outside, Prabhup looked up at the night sky, filled with guilt. He couldn't help but reflect, had his tactics over the past 7 days had too many faults? Was it his command mistakes that had led to the present situation? Could it be, that I've let down the governor's trust? But no matter what, on the last day, I will personally take up a rifle and go to the front lines. Even if we can't hold until the 8th day, even if the Lumen people take our position, it will only be after we are all dead. He swore through clenched teeth. But just then, he saw in the sky, long trails of flame streaking across the night. Chapter 419. If one word could describe the current state of mind of both King Lumen and Guming, it would be this. Panic-stricken. When Prabhup saw the orange-red tail flame slicing through the night sky, he still didn't quite dare to confirm what it was. After all, the starship communication equipment he owned had been destroyed in a prior bombing, and he himself had barely escaped with his life, while Leroy had gone deaf in one ear, which was already considered lucky. The immobile communication equipment certainly couldn't be saved. But Guming was different. He had an open line of communication with the 4 Chamber of Commerce fleets still under his control, and even had an independent star language tower that could make interstellar calls. He knew for certain that the Blade Tiger, a starship belonging to the Empire Navy Pegasus fleet, wasn't approaching to help him. Without concrete intelligence, he could roughly confirm that the military aboard that starship was commanded by his cousin's son. Upon hearing the news, he was incensed, making numerous calls to many key figures on Flying Wing Star. However, the 3 most important calls, those directed to the leader of the Star Sector Pei Desi, the Tianma Fleet Commander Tyler Mungs, and the naval aristocratic Fufana family, all went unanswered. Clearly, they were deliberately not picking up. By this time, even if he clung to any hope, he understood one fact: he had been abandoned. The politics of the Star Sector had chosen to stand with Wang Qi and Gu Hang, mother and son. At this point, his mindset began to undergo some interesting changes. After rage, hope, and the shattering of that hope, he became hysterical. He ordered the 4 Chamber of Commerce fleets to prevent the Blade Tiger's approach at all costs. This was a mad command, one he might not have been thinking clearly about when issuing. What did it mean to attack the Imperial Navy actively? Was it a real desire to rebel? Stay connected with Empire. If they won, there would be no chance of doing anything like the Empire Commerce Guild again, they'd all have to run for their lives. If they were lucky enough to flee and become interstellar pirates, that would already be good fortune. Fortunately, while Guming had gone mad, the front-line commanders of the 4 Chamber of Commerce fleets had not. They listened as the Imperial Navy opened public communications, repeatedly calling in the name of the Imperial Navy and the Tianma fleet for all interstellar vessels in the region to cease all hostile actions, or else be regarded as traitors to the Empire. These front-line commanders each made calls under the pretext of confirming orders, initially probing the authenticity of the command. When Guming repeatedly emphasized that the orders indeed came from him, they then painstakingly began trying to persuade him otherwise. Regardless, whether you, Guming, listen or not, we definitely won't fire. Following you to cause trouble, with our heads on our belts, igniting a family feud, was all for the sake of a better future. Our own boss becoming the head of the family, so we could earn more and gain a better status. But to go up against the Imperial Navy was absolutely different. Whether it was those concerned for their own prospects or those who were loyal to Guming, they were all advising him. Even the latter knew that once they took action, there really would be no turning back. Otherwise, what? Really become pirates? If they had that determination, why cause trouble at all? Guming gradually calmed down, breaking out in a cold sweat. Fortunately, no shots were fired. Not only was naval combat out of the question, but even when the Blade Tiger's landing craft were flying towards the planet's surface, they couldn't be attacked. The landing crafts were part of the Blade Tiger, which belonged to the Imperial Navy. It was one thing for the troops from Rage Owl Star to be released after landing, but what if they were blown up in midair, utterly annihilated with no evidence left? What would happen if it was claimed that the troops were from the Navy Marine Corps stationed on the starship? There would be no way to refute it. There was no choice but to let them land and fight then. Ness Lumen was beside himself with frustration and anger. How can the Empire Navy do this? It's so unfair. What if this is just the beginning? What if the troops from Rage Owl Star are continuously transported to Hagian Star by the Empire Navy? Are we just going to stand by and watch? Do you expect me, with the power of a single kingdom, to confront a whole planet? He kept talking, his expression filled with sorrow and indignation. Gu Ming sighed and then said to Lumen, "At this point, we can only fight to the death. Can you muster more troops? Especially more knights, Knight Titan. I will compensate for your losses in the future." At this, Lumen pushed him hard. Gu Ming fell to the ground. His bodyguards and the guards of the Lumen Kingdom all moved, but since no blood had been shed yet, everyone just drew their weapons and pointed them at the other side, but no one fired. Ness Lumen, with eyes reddened, stared at Gu Ming. "I've staked everything I have, but the situation is nothing like what you promised before. I will compensate." "Compensate my ass!" Ness Lumen burst out with a curse. "The question now is whether we can win or not." Gu Ming stood up and stared back at Ness Lumen. "Don't talk to me in that tone, as if everything wrong was caused by me. The decision was made by us together, and the main force was your army. Do you think I don't know that the key issue now is whether we can win? Just now, I was even about to let my fleet attack the Empire Navy to win." Having said this, Gu Ming calmed down a bit. "We absolutely cannot afford any discord between us right now, do you understand? I need your strength, or else I can't win, and you need me too, or else even if you win, you won't gain anything." Lumen tousled his hair and let out a reluctant roar of anger. He really regretted it. But what could he do? Blinded by folly. After a while, he said, "There are still 3 Knight Titans in the kingdom, but those 3 Marquises, they might not listen to me completely. I will try to persuade them, I will make some promises, and you will have to help me keep those promises in the future. If they agree to stand with us, in addition to the 3 Knight Titans, we can muster 300 Sentinel Knights and 200,000 conscripted soldiers. Not enough. I can also contact a few other countries that have put a lot of diplomatic pressure on us recently, essentially because they are dissatisfied that our actions were taken without notifying them and without any promises of benefits to them. I can share some future power to get at least their non-interference, if not their support. This would allow me to call up some more border defense forces. Still not enough. Then you come up with something. Can you pray to the Emperor to conjure us an army of 1,000,000? At this point, Gu Ming confirmed that he truly had exhausted all resources of the Lumen Kingdom. Then let's go with that, but we must be quick, we are running out of time. Chapter 420. Ness Lumen and Gu Ming, after a conflict erupted, had to reconcile under the pressure of reality because they were in the same boat. They reacted quickly, gathering a stronger army to face the predicament. Of course, their target was still very clear, to deal with the suburban town. The reason was simple. They had already experienced the combat effectiveness of the Rage Owl Star people. Gu Ming couldn't understand how his young nephew, who had been on Rage Owl Star for less than 2 years, could have trained such a strong army on that planet. Before he arrived, that planet even had great difficulty paying the imperial tax. But no matter how incredible he found it, this was an ironclad reality, and lamenting would only lead to compliance. They dared not underestimate the mighty Rage Owl Star people. If tens of thousands of fresh troops descended from the sky, they didn't know how long and at what cost it would take to annihilate them all. Even to put it bluntly, the 2 powerful dukes mentioned by Ness Lumen, the real nobility, even if they followed his words and obeyed his orders to start gathering troops immediately, it might already be too late to do anything now. In a feudal country, how strong could the military organization capability be? The Rage Owl Star people's troops had already crossed the sky and begun orbital landing. Calling forces from all over the country now would simply be too late. At most, they could squeeze out a bit more military strength from the nearest locations. The rest of the troops would be nothing more than strong reinforcements and reserves at best. The newly enlisted forces would be divided into 2 parts. One part would be deployed to the outskirts of capital Pansel City to join the siege on the suburban town. Continue reading at Empire. They could also sense that the soldiers from Rage Owl Star in the suburban town were at the end of their rope. With a surge of fresh troops and added vigor, maybe in the following days, they could break through the small town. During the past few days, they could confirm that Miss Wang Qi had definitely not escaped from the town. As long as they could capture or kill Wang Qi, there would still be room for discussion. The other part of the army would be organized to confront the new reinforcing troops of Rage Owl Star people. Based on the streaks of fire across the sky, they could roughly estimate that those landing craft descending from orbit were about 200 to 300 kilometers away from Pansel capital. They speculated that the Rage Owl Star people did so mainly to avoid the orbital defense system's most powerful area above the capital. Indeed, Gu Ming's nephew must have seized the opportunity, assumed the mantle of the Imperial Navy, and was sure they would not dare attack an official fleet of the Imperial Navy. However, landing craft descending to the surface were a different matter. Ground-based orbital air defense could reach starships in space if the relative position of the starship was within the firing angle and the distance was indeed in orbital range, and it could just barely reach them. But planetary firepower was inevitably stationary, and it couldn't be powerful enough to destroy escort ships in the sky with a sudden barrage of fire, or else wouldn't the enemy just flee? If they fled, adding the accusation of attacking the Imperial Navy, both Gu Ming and the Lumen Kingdom of Heijian Star would be unable to shake off the accusation of being traitors to the Empire who attacked the Imperial Navy. It was different for landing craft, they couldn't escape while flying towards the surface. That Gu Hang probably had some fear too, worrying that if they were indeed attacked during landing, the losses would be too great. Moreover, there would be room for contention afterward. The distance of about 300 kilometers allowed them to break through the atmosphere from other airspaces. When they flew lower and left the angle of attack of the orbital air defenses, the safety was much higher, and they became difficult to target unless the Lumen Kingdom was so powerful as to integrate all other countries' orbital fire on the entire planet for a joint strike, achieving full coverage. Otherwise, relying solely on themselves, they indeed couldn't cover the entire planet's airspace. After landing, when the army moved rapidly forward, orbital air defense would be of no use. Although a distance of about 300 kilometers wasn't too far for a mechanized, motorized ground army indeed, they could arrive in a few days if they rapidly advanced. Ness Lumen and Gu Ming still decided to take some action. The newly enlisted troops were gathered for this purpose. This force would carry out strict defense along the way, setting up barriers, and blocking the approaching Rage Owl Star People's Army. They did not seek victory or annihilation, only to delay the marching speed of the enemy and buy some extra time for the battle on the outskirts of Pansel. If the battle on the outskirts of Pansel concluded in victory, then they would have succeeded. They felt this strategy was very meaningful. Implementing it seemed to have a quite high chance of success. Even though they would have to face an alliance army within the Lumen Kingdom afterward, as long as Wang Qi died, many things could be discussed later. However, the three pieces of news that reached their ears next were all bad. The first was that the remnants of the alliance army in the suburban town had erupted with a strong will to resist. They seemed to realize that reinforcements were nearby, and under their heightened morale, they became even more tenacious. The second was that the newly arrived alliance army did not rest after landing. Instead, with an incredibly large number of over 100 lion tanks leading the way, followed by numerous armored vehicles, self-propelled artillery, and transport trucks, they assaulted forward fiercely, rushing with astonishing speed. The hastily gathered defense troops were rendered ineffective, dispersed with a single charge, shattered with a single strike. Even in a minor engagement, 20 mecha sentries of the Lumen Kingdom dug out a stout position, along with the hard-earned assembly of 2,000 infantry, intending to resist for at least several hours. Yet, within 20 minutes, they were thoroughly defeated. Of course, if it was just that, it would have been merely embarrassing for them and not caused complete panic. What truly alarmed them were two forces that moved so fast they couldn't think of a countermeasure. When the two had just received the news about these two forces, they were already nearing the outskirts of Pansel City. These two forces comprised 15 red armored giants and more than 100 Wind Falcon rapid attack vessels. Chapter 421. 15 red armored warriors, that naturally meant Phoenix. These Imperial Angels were the first batch to descend from the landing craft. This type of landing craft, coming from the Blade Tiger, was named the Type V landing craft. As a landing craft designed for orbital assaulting operations, it was quite large. A single one could carry 500 people, along with corresponding weapons and equipment, even heavy vehicles. It was also equipped with jamming devices to defend against anti-aircraft fire, furnished with small energy shield generators that provided some defensive capabilities, and had relatively solid armor. Apart from lacking weaponry and not being very fast, this type of landing craft was a powerful item and costs a lot to produce, not in the same league as ordinary civilian transport ships. On the Blade Tiger, there were only 2 such landing crafts, plus some smaller landing crafts. If they were all deployed, they could transport a force of about 2,000 men to the ground at a time, and then circulate back and forth. Taking into account the travel time, loading, and unloading, they could make a trip in 6 hours at the limit. This was not a very efficient rate, but there was no helping it. The Blade Tiger itself was not particularly large, being just an escort ship. It had about 10,000 crew members, so squeezing in 30,000 soldiers was already beyond its capacity. They even occupied a lot of other space, staying temporarily, and equipment was packed to the brim, to the extent that Yelazia even teased Gu Hang, Blade Tiger has become a fat pig now. So, this was the scarce configuration of landing crafts on the Blade Tiger. For those large-scale landing operations, it would either be a large starship, or specialized landing starships. According to estimates, to get all his 35,000 soldiers to the ground, even if the landing craft operated non-stop, it would need around 100 hours, over 4 days. This period was actually the most vulnerable time for the landing troops. But the problem was that the Lumen Kingdom's army was even more vulnerable. The main forces were besieging the outskirt towns, so the troops they could send were few in number, and of poor quality. The first wave of the Alliance army that came down directly crushed all those enemies who had surrounded the landing zone. Subsequently, more troops descended and began to expand outwards, building temporary positions. They were to hold this area for a while. However, at the same time, Gu Hang also made the demand for swift military action. A composite camp would set out first and push ahead. After 1 day's time, when the first extinguishing wind brigade almost finished assembling, they would complete their assembly and continue to advance, breaking through the enemy and leaving a small faction to guard the landing zone. Then, as the following divisions and brigades arrived, they would follow the steps of the troops that had set out earlier and continue to push outward. This was the situation that the hastily assembled interception force of the Lumen Kingdom had to face. Acting this way, of course, was not as steady as waiting 4 days to complete the troop assembly before engaging in combat. But it also did not give the opponent time to prepare. With the military quality gap between both sides, it really was a case of puncture upon impact. However, all this barely mattered to the Starship Warriors. While the follow-up troops were still disembarking and assembling, they had already received the orders from the Governor-General and boarded 3 Wind Falcons, heading towards the target location at high speed. 300 kilometers, the Wind Falcons arrived swiftly. To avoid getting hit, the Wind Falcons flew very low. Orbital anti-aircraft cannons couldn't touch targets flying too low, as there was a limit to the shooting angle. As long as the Wind Falcons didn't actually fly over the few orbital air defense positions of Pincer City, it was fine. Low-altitude flying was not easy, but in this area, it was still smooth. Mainly because the terrain outside Pincer City was quite flat, without the frequent rise of high mountains, the speedboats had strong flying performance, plus the pilots were no longer the novices they were when the Air Force was first established, and after a long flying time, they had honed their skills. Their first target was to attack the artillery position of the Lumen Legion, which was besieging the outskirt towns. In the early stages of the battle, the Lumen Kingdom's artillery forces were severely suppressed. Range and power couldn't keep up, mobility was poor, and as soon as they emerged, before they could move, they would be hit by counter-bombardment from Alliance artillery. Your next journey awaits at Empire. However, recently they were invigorated again, mainly because the Alliance was running out of artillery and even more so of ammunition. But now, they faced disaster. They were not totally unprepared. After the Lumen army observed the approaching Air Force and especially after they deduced their target was the artillery position, they quickly informed the front line about the enemy situation, asking them to be cautious in response, and they even mobilized troops for defense. However, it was futile. What could they do even if they were prepared? The Wind Falcons couldn't be too arrogant. They launched a round of missiles from afar and then scooted away without conducting a low-altitude strafing run, which would give the enemy an opportunity. God forbid getting unlucky and having one of those sentry mechas take down a craft, that would be a huge loss. As for the Starship Warriors, they simply jumped out of the Wind Falcons. Delivering Starship Warriors via Wind Falcon was extremely convenient, not at all like delivering regular soldiers who would either need to rappel down or require the Wind Falcon to land on the ground. For the Starship Warriors, it might not be feasible if it were too high, but at a distance of about 10 meters, jumping down was no big deal. Even better, the Wind Falcons could maintain forward flight, just not too fast. This significantly increased the speed of troop deployment and the safety of the Wind Falcons themselves. Chapter 422. Interstellar warriors who weighed several tons with their armor could create a crater when they landed on the ground. But afterwards, they would come out of the pit unscathed. At this moment, enemies had already surrounded them. But what could mere cannon fodder do? Bullets hit them without leaving even a scratch. Guided by the lead of Commander Maddens, the 15 interstellar warriors moved methodically toward the artillery position. Along the way, they fired their guns steadily and dispassionately, each bullet claiming the life of one or several enemies. 5 sentry mechs appeared, attempting to resist. They had some resistance to explosive bullet guns and weren't so easily killed. But in front of the interstellar warriors, they were like chicks. If one shot didn't blow them up, 5 explosive bullet guns aimed and fired in an incredibly accurate barrage, emptying 5 magazines, naturally shredding the sentry mechs. Among them, Madden's was the most ferocious. Wearing Terminator armor, he could wield a heavy explosive bullet gun single-handedly, a weapon designed to break through armor. In contrast, the sentry mech's machine guns posed a threat to the interstellar warriors. But they had to hit their target first. There was a qualitative difference in shooting accuracy and reaction speed between the two sides. As soon as the trigger was pulled, before even 2 rounds could be fired, they were blown up. In a single encounter, 4 sentries were gone. The remaining one, due to its close proximity, wasn't selected as a target for concentrated fire. In 1 or 2 seconds, it fired many rounds from its machine gun, hitting only a few, but those could only strike the shoulder armor of the advancing interstellar warriors, at most causing their bodies to jerk and leaving small dents in their armor. The fate of this sentry mech was even more tragic. Anat, the new blood in the battle group, was at the forefront. With just a few accelerated steps, he reached the sentry mech's front. The sentry mechs, compared to the interstellar warriors, were still considerably larger. Even with armor, interstellar warriors were generally only around 2.4 meters tall. Madden's in his Terminator stood at 2.7 meters. The sentry mechs were over 3 meters tall. But being larger didn't necessarily mean stronger combat capabilities. The sentry mech moved first, its night sword sweeping towards Anat, but it missed as Anat simply bent down and dodged it. Then, with an explosive burst of speed from his legs, Anat surprised the sentry mech's pilot by closing the distance to an extremely close range. A battle blade, honed through 1,000 uses, was thrust precisely into the armor gap of the sentry, severing its power systems instantly. Anat exerted more force, flipping the mech over, stepping on its chest. He wielded his knife in one hand and grabbed its head with the other. With a concerted effort, he ripped the sentry mech's head off. Sentry mechs are not night titans, they don't have exclusive cockpits, as the pilot is encapsulated inside the mech. When the mech's head was pulled off, the pilot's head came off with it. Completing this sequence of actions only took Anat 3 to 5 seconds. After sheathing his battle blade and rearming his gun, he hastened forward. In those 3 to 5 seconds, his comrades had already passed him, continuing onward. During this time, no one even glanced in his direction. Killing a sentry mech simply wasn't noteworthy. Anat didn't think he had done anything remarkable either, he had to hurry to catch up. But this scene, in the eyes of the nearby Lumen soldiers, was utterly terrifying. Those were 5 Night Masters. In their minds, the Night Masters were unbeatable. If the Night Masters had been killed by heavy artillery or taken out by so-called Alliance soldiers' rocket launchers and mortars during earlier battles, it would have been understandable. After all, warfare is indiscriminate, and even Night Masters, clad in their armors, could be struck down by targeted attacks and dreadful firepower. Not to mention, the Alliance troops had those formidable tanks and armored vehicles. It was natural for Night Masters to fall in battle. And even so, taking down a 3-meter-tall sentry mech still wasn't easy. It often required a rather long fight, and the Alliance army would also pay a price. But now, that was a completely different concept. 5 knights, standing in front of those red-armored warriors, were almost instantly wiped out in a single encounter. They were killed as effortlessly as if they were just chickens. For the conscripted soldiers of the Lumen Kingdom, this was a scene that completely shattered their fighting spirit. And those with slightly broader knowledge, who had heard some stories, finally remembered some legends at this moment. These are Star Warriors. They are angels. The words shouted out uncontrollably caused even more deterioration in the fighting will of those who heard. And so, this obstructing army just collapsed. The Phoenixes didn't even pursue. They were just some insignificant troops, which they approached with indifference and then destroyed their artillery positions. Not until the battle ended, and no new troops came to disturb them anymore. This battle was fought with a lack of interest. The veterans felt it was nothing more than a walk in the park. What was the difference between this and shooting at moving targets in training? Only the sentry mechs were of slight interest, a bit more resistant, but there were too few of them. As for the new recruits, most also found it uninteresting. It was their first time leaving Rage Owl Star for combat. They were initially a bit tense, but after the battle, they felt That's it. It wasn't even as good as fighting the cultists in the North Territory of Rage Owl Star. At least those cultists were not afraid to die and possessed some psychic spells, which posed a threat, not to mention the subsequent entry into the True Realm, facing the evil god, and even emerging victorious in the end. The new recruits couldn't muster any enthusiasm either. Even the 3 ripe new recruits, who at least had rotated through the Viking Valley province's border during their training and growth periods without armor, joined the Green Valley Group army in their constant southward sweeps, exterminating many aberrant beasts, thereby gaining some combat experience. Discover more content at Empire. They too felt that the level of the Lumen soldiers was far too poor. After destroying the artillery positions, they turned to find a new target. Their eyes locked on a Ranger-class Night Titan that had its shield generator destroyed during the previous battle and now only dared to serve as a long-range rocket launcher from afar. The 2 Night Titans were the biggest threats to the outskirts of the town, even if this one was too scared to advance directly and was content bombarding from a distance with extended-range rockets, which was quite annoying. It was best to just take it out. Guming and Ness Lumen both suspected what the news of the 15 red-armored giants indicated when they first heard it. Despite that, they still harbored some faint hope. How could they truly be Star Warriors? Why would the Emperor's angels appear on such a backwater planet as Hagian Star? Their battles usually caused upheaval across multiple star sectors or were fought on the front lines against powerful foreign species. What merit or capability did a minor conflict within the Gu family on Hagian Star have to attract a group of Star Warriors? It's not like there were true Imperial traitors here. Besides, even if there were Imperial traitors, unless the treason was significant, it would not provoke the intervention of Star Warriors. Therefore, their initial disbelief and hope for luck were understandable. According to Guming's self-consolation, there might be a chance that his nephew orchestrated it all, using ordinary iron armor to put on a facade. But even he didn't believe that. And then, reality completely shattered his wishful thinking. Within minutes of landing, they decimated a sentry mecha squad and routed a large group of Lumen forces, also scattering the Lumen Legion's artillery positions. Now, those 15 figures were heading their way, aiming for the Night Titan near them. The troops had done their best to intercept, but they just couldn't hold them back. The 2 of them were completely panicked. Chapter 423. When Ness Lumen and Guming were so panicked that they didn't know what to do, the phoenixes they greatly feared, which had inspired enormous dread in them, had completed their second task and successfully retreated. They had destroyed the Night Titan that had lost its shield generator. To be honest, the process was not easy. The Space Warriors were strong, very strong, but not truly invincible. For example, a machine gun fired at the shoulder plates, chest plates, or even the helmet might indeed not do much harm. But a shot to the waist, joints, or back would cause them just as much pain. And even if they could only hit the thickest part of the armor, a few bullets or dozens of machine gun rounds were still manageable, but it becomes useless when hundreds of rounds rain down. Those were machine gun rounds, not ordinary bullets. Space Warriors weren't so easy to hit. They might seem large and wear heavy armor, but their movements were incredibly agile and swift. Although they were not much smaller than the Sentinel mechas, in a real fight, the Sentinel mechas' agility and speed in turning the machine guns fixed to their sides couldn't keep up at all. They were merely taking hits passively. But when the number of Sentinel mechas assembled in the hundreds, and a few thousand miscellaneous troops were added to the mix, just to block bullets and sight, serving as cannon fodder, it was quite troublesome. Moreover, could the Night Titan be ignored? Both the weapons in its hands posed a fatal threat to Space Warriors. A grenade cannon barrage, if it hit the fringes, might not be too bad, but if it hit right in the center, even Space Warriors wearing tactical power armor had to die. A gravity fist coming down was something not even Maddens himself, clad in Terminator armor and champion of the squad, would dare to take head-on. After losing the energy shield, the Night Titan's pilot became particularly timid. Knowing that Space Warriors were charging at him made him even more panicky. However, running was definitely not an option. If isolated with no protection from the infantry and Sentinel mechas, he would become even more vulnerable. He had no choice but to fight bravely, using the grenade launcher from afar, behind the Sentinel mechas and miscellaneous troop cannon fodder, to bombard the Space Warriors. But it was ineffective. Indeed, a direct hit could kill a Space Warrior, but you have to hit first. As soon as they raised their hands, the warriors noticed their targeting and began maneuvering, completely avoiding the blast. Often after a barrage, the Space Warriors remained unharmed, at most only getting their power armor paint scratched by shrapnel, while the nearby soldiers of the Lumen Kingdom army were mistakenly killed in large numbers. But overall, this was an appropriate tactic, and it did effectively slow down the advance of the space warriors. After all, there were only 15 phoenixes, and there was no heavy firepower to support them. When their speed of action was slowed down, and they were bogged down in the quagmire, the mission was pretty much a failure. To keep fighting hard, one slip-up could indeed lead to casualties. But at this moment, a new force appeared. The Allied Air Force. Previously, only 3 Wind Falcons had hastily brought the space warriors to the battlefield. More fighters were still on board the starship Blade Tiger and hadn't yet disembarked. But now, they had finished unloading. 100 Wind Falcons set off at high speed in a relatively low altitude, avoiding the flawed anti-aircraft fire network of the Lumen Kingdom, and quickly arrived above the battlefield. And they were exactly what Maddens relied on to attempt an attack and destroy the Night Titan. The flight of 100 fighters swept in. Without any hesitation, they first fired 2 rounds of airborne missiles. These missiles were quite powerful, and had they all targeted the Night Titan without its energy shield, just these airborne missiles would have been enough to severely damage it. Continue your adventure at Empire. However, the Allied Air Force did not do so. They had greater ambitions and sought to achieve more victories. Their bombing target was the Lumen Legion, which was interposed between the Phoenix and the Night Titan. Except for a few bombs aimed at that ranger to limit and threaten it, the other bombs seriously discombobulated the Lumen Legion's ground forces. Bombing the rank and file is trivial, the main targets were still the Sentinel mechas. This round of airstrikes took out quite a few. And the weaponry carried by the Wind Falcons was not limited to just airborne missiles. Autocannons, laser cannons, they had it all, and the firepower was no less than that of a single Sentinel mecha. The key was that they could fly. As they began to hover and strafe, the formation of 100 Wind Falcons managed to disarray the Lumen Legion's formation with missile bombardment and autocannon ground support, causing significant casualties. However, the Wind Falcons also suffered losses in the process. Since it was low-altitude combat, the danger was high. Sentinel mechas weren't just taking hits without fighting back. When they raised their heads to fire their autocannons into the sky, it was like having countless anti-aircraft guns. While the armor of the Wind Falcons was thicker than that of traditional aircraft, they were far more fragile than Sentinel mechas when it came to taking damage. Since the start of the battle, 8 Wind Falcons were shot down in a short time. However, such losses were deemed worthwhile. The Starship Warriors, who were almost dragged into the mud at the front, were now reinvigorated. In the chaotic battlefield, 15 red giants charged fiercely. In coordination with the Wind Falcons in the sky, the Sentinel mechas suffered heavy losses. The makeshift group of 100 Sentinel mechas had now been halved, with the remainder either cowering in fear, trying to flee, or scattered about, blocked by their own troops whose order had been obliterated, and rendered ineffectual. The path forward for the Starship Warriors was now clear. And their objective had always remained unchanged. The Night Titan had no intention of sitting and awaiting death. In such a dire situation, it too was provoked into aggression. With its grenade cannon spent and no time to reload, it braced against the bombardment of bombs and heavy missiles with its thick armor, charged forward, and launched a hard-hitting gravity fist at the approaching Maddens. Missed. During Madden's long combat career, he had certainly come across Night Titans. Though he had dealt with them as allies, he fully understood that Night Titans should not be underestimated. Even clad in Terminator armor, he did not wish to engage in a contest of strength. He dodged nimbly with a quick side roll, avoiding the explosive impact of the gravity fist. The aftermath was fierce, but manageable for the Terminator. He raised his power sword high and delivered a savage slash, cutting off the Night Titan's gravity fist at the joint as it failed to retract in time. Immediately after, he boldly advanced and slammed fiercely into the Night Titan. His stature was less than half that of the Night Titan, his head just reaching the level of the Titan's pelvis. But this collision still toppled the massive behemoth. Then, the power sword swiftly swung, showcasing the level of a squad champion's swordsmanship. First, the weapon was disarmed, then came the decapitation, followed by the destruction of the power system. In a matter of seconds, Maddens had struck over a dozen blows, dismembering the Night Titan. And this whole process was clearly witnessed by Ness Lumen and Gu Ming, who were in the midst of fleeing. Their command center was not far from there, and realizing the direness of the situation, the two of them immediately thought to run. But during their escape, they personally witnessed this scene. They were chilled to the core. Chapter 424. The Phoenix Battle Group and the Allied Air Force's battle reports were listened to by Gu Heng at the command center of the Alliance Expeditionary Force, located in a suburban town. Truly speaking, Gu Heng was the first person from the entire army to support the suburban town. He was among the first batch to set foot on the ground from the spacecraft. The commanding officers of the troops vehemently opposed this decision by the planetary governor. It was too dangerous. In their opinion, His Excellency the Governor shouldn't have come at all, he should have stayed safe and sound on Rage Owl Star. If he insisted on leading the expedition in person, he should have remained aboard a relatively safe starship, from where he could command. What was the point of coming to the front line? However, Gu Heng only did a bit to soothe their concerns and did not heed their advice. Not that he considered his life insignificant, but he had great confidence in himself. On one hand, he was certain that his great-uncle, who didn't dare to engage in combat in the starry sky as the Blade Tiger approached, nor dare to force the Lumen Kingdom's army to use orbital strike forces against the warships that had reached the planet's orbit, would also be unlikely to attack the descending landing ships. Furthermore, the chosen location for the landing ships avoided the anti-air defense perimeter near the capital, further ensuring safety during the landing. The other source of his confidence was his own strength. Not only had he ascended to a level 7 spiritual energy user, significantly increasing his strength from before, but the crucial point was the prowess and unique traits he had obtained after defeating the evil god. Factoring in all these enhancements, even if the landing ship he was on were to be blown out of the sky, he could still safely land on the ground. Experience Tales at Empire. He left the entire process of uniting the troops after landing to his 4 division commanders and swiftly flew to the suburban town by activating his spiritual energy. He arrived even faster than the Wind Falcon, which had to be dragged out of the landing ship. This also makes it evident that despite Gu Heng's seemingly calm exterior, he was somewhat anxious in his heart. His arrival had significant practical implications. With his current spiritual energy level, it might be a bit difficult to tear a Night Titan apart from a distance unless he tore open a Divine Realm rift to strengthen his spiritual energy. But if that Night Titan dared to expose itself a little longer in front of him, or if Gu Heng took a risk and got close enough to cross the energy shield, then he could achieve this feat. As for ordinary sentinel mechas, they were even less of a challenge. Gu Heng estimated that a single lightning strike from him would kill one outright. And if the enemy chose to charge in a dense formation, a chained lightning attack or a storm of lightning clouds manifested through spiritual energy could do the job. After gaining Storm Dominator, his spiritual energy could transform into lightning, which was much more powerful and sheer destructive force than the telekinesis he used before. With Gu Heng in place, the Alliance side had added a battalion of artillery. Not only was the firepower intense, but it was also incredibly precise. That was the direct help Gu Heng could offer to the battlefield. And in the event of a critical point in the battle, he could reveal his ultimate move, tearing open the Divine Realm rift. Doing so would not only significantly enhance his own spiritual energy, but also, from within the Divine Realm, he could call upon thousands of heroic spirit warriors. And if worst came to worst, he could summon an inferior deity incarnation. Still in the form of a thunderstorm colossal bear, although its strength couldn't match that of a great demon, it possessed at least 30% of its capabilities, tearing apart a Night Titan as easily as ripping apart a toy. However, all these moves were too conspicuous. It was true that he was a sanctioned spiritual energy user, but being able to tear open a rift in the True Realm and summon heroic spirits from the True Realm to fight, such feats were far too extraordinary and beyond the capabilities of a regular spiritual energy user. If word got out, it would surely bring about an investigation from the Imperial Inquisition. Regarding the Imperial Inquisition, his status as a planetary governor and the excuse of being a legitimate spiritual energy user would not protect him. If it went so far as them crazily insisting on taking Gu Heng to the tribunal in the Eastern Cosmos domain for scrutiny, then Gu Heng would have no choice but to slaughter them and break ties with the tribunal. Otherwise, actually go there? Of course, it would be best for such a situation not to occur at all. Unless absolutely necessary, he would certainly not reveal his ability to open the Divine Realm rift. And in fact, the battle situation was far from that point. Indeed, the enemy had intensified their offensive on the suburban town due to the arrival of the Rage Owl Star troops. Hastily reinforcing their ranks and at the commander's behest, they launched a fierce attack. The troops under Perbuff in the suburban town, though not out of food, were almost out of ammunition. Despite this, Gu Heng's arrival and his public appearance greatly boosted the morale of the Alliance army stationed in the town, but objective conditions do not shift according to human will. Gu Heng himself was also ready to intervene, at least initially planning to create a storm using his regular spiritual energy to bolster the Alliance army's firepower. But it wasn't necessary. The enemy's assault had barely begun when it was abruptly halted by the starfighters who had just landed. The Phoenixes had knocked out an artillery position in one fell swoop, and the Lumen army soldiers naturally couldn't proceed with their advance, retreating in disarray to regroup. Then, that Night Titan, long deprived of its shield generator and used as a makeshift rocket launcher from afar, was taken down, and the starfighters, under the cover of Wind Falcons, retreated orderly. After distancing themselves from the enemy, they boarded fighters and flew into the town. Chapter 425. When Gu Hang received the battle report a step ahead, he knew that there was no need for him to worry about the situation on the battlefield. He said to his mother, who appeared somewhat haggard and disheveled, "My army, they haven't failed their mission, have they?" Miss Wang Qi no longer had the aloof demeanor she used to present in her previous encounters with Gu Hang. She sighed, "Thanks to General Perbuff and the warriors of Rage Owl Star, without their desperate fighting, without their tremendous sacrifices, I surely would have died here, captured by Gu Ming. He would never let me go." Gu Hang exclaimed, "I didn't expect that the Gu family, long renowned for its unity, would end up like this. Didn't you predict this long ago? Being prepared is one thing, but having it actually happen is quite another. With regard to Gu Ming, once caught, how do you plan to deal with him? He's not caught yet. Are you so sure he can't escape?" It was only natural for Wang Qi to ask this question. From the starship belonging to her, she couldn't dispatch any ship to land in the outskirts town to take her away, but Gu Ming could. Although, in the vastness of space, Gu Ming's fleet was few in number and at a disadvantage, there was no orbital air defense system on the ground to strike his ship. It was quite possible for him to take a ship and flee. Gu Hang didn't see it that way. He can't escape. The ground-based orbital air defense cannons aren't under his control. Wang Qi immediately understood what her son meant. In essence, the orbital air defense system was controlled by Ness Lumen. Indeed, Ness was Gu Ming's ally and would help him intercept Wang Qi's ships, preventing her from retreating. However, if Gu Ming wanted to flee, Ness Lumen probably wouldn't allow it. It would mean abandoning him. If that situation occurred, Gu Hang judged that the two would most likely turn against each other. Wang Qi too agreed with her son's assessment. As for the situation on the ground, in front of his mother, Gu Hang also revealed his strong confidence, in no more than 2 days, the capital will fall. As long as Gu Ming does not escape by ship, then my army will definitely catch him. Wang Qi had no doubts about this. The forces led by Perbuff, 30,000 strong, had managed to hold their position here for 8 days. During those 8 days, the opposing army hadn't rested at all, continuously launching fierce attacks. But not only did he hold them off, he had also destroyed 2 Night Titans of the Lumen Kingdom in the previous battles. And now, Gu Hang himself had brought reinforcements. Not only was there another 35,000 troops, which was more than Perbuff's group, but the number of lion tanks was also 3 times that of the original expeditionary force, reaching well over 100. Additionally, there were 100 Wind Falcon aircraft as air support. With such military might, the Lumen Kingdom could no longer muster the resources to contend. At their peak, perhaps they could have, but in the past 8 days of battle, the Lumen people had suffered heavy losses. Ness had nearly lost half of the royal legions. Even if he could convince those purported dukes to fully support him, it would merely restore their former strength. But under Gu Hang's command, there was an even more extraordinary asset, 15 space warriors. When she first heard this news, even Wang Qi had found it completely unbelievable. She had dealt with a warband named the Exterminators, a fleet-based group without a home planet, relying mainly on a starship fleet. While personally leading a mission to resupply the Exterminators, they were somewhat short on cash, asking her convoy to wait a while, and they would soon have the funds. At the time, the Exterminators were participating in a civil war, and Wang Qi witnessed with her own eyes how, after joining the battle, they swept through the Imperial traitors on that planet like a breeze through fallen leaves. The warband's combat style was ruthless, not valuing the lives of mere mortals. After their victory, the slaughter and plunder they performed were done cleanly and lived up to their name. But that was secondary. After winning the war, the planetary governor held a banquet to thank the space warriors, but every member of the Exterminators who attended wore armor and, candidly demanding, requested the governor to pay for supplies. The battle was over, and they needed supplies. According to the Exterminators, this was for the subsequent wars. They would set off on their journey again, rushing to the next battlefield. Naturally, this required materials. They also needed population and weaponry to replenish starship sailors and the mortal auxiliary army. They needed to conscript on the planets, requiring a large number of youths to select new soldiers through brutal survival trials and trials with extremely high death rates. All these demands were listed out by the exterminators with quotas, requiring the planetary governor to provide them in a timely and sufficient manner. If not met, they would claim it themselves. Anyone daring to obstruct them would be treated as rebels. The planetary governor failed to gather enough and hoped for more time from the interstellar warriors. But the exterminators acted without a second word, just as they said they could take it themselves. Miss Wang-Chi saw all of this with her own eyes. Some of the blood-stained war spoils and taxes were used by the exterminators to pay for the supplies. That encounter left a profound impression on Miss Wang-Chi. She thought, at the very least, the exterminators would at least face some reprimand from the Empire, since they had attacked and plundered an imperial planet. But in reality, that didn't happen. The exterminators moved on to the next war, while that planetary governor, on the other hand, was punished by the Empire. Indeed, the interstellar warriors were angels, but don't forget the prefix to the name angel is death. The mercy they brought from the Emperor usually involved sending those in need of mercy to the Emperor's side for a personal experience. During her visit to Rage Owl Star, she hadn't seen the Phoenix. Initially, she thought it was an ally, an external force her son had invited from somewhere. But later, she found out that those interstellar warriors were actually under Gu Hang's command. Fear of the interstellar warriors was implanted in her heart, and firmly believing that the Emperor's angels were not to be offended, even better not to deal with at all, Miss Wang-Chi was now immensely shocked to see 15 interstellar warriors fighting for her son. She was uneasy about this, but she did recognize the combat prowess of the interstellar warriors. With the assistance of those 15 death angels, victory in the war should be indeed as her son said, without any problems. Thinking of this, she looked deeply into Gu Hang's face. Being able to command the interstellar warriors was something she didn't understand, it concerned her, but she had to admit even more so that her son truly had the capability. Afterward, mother and son returned to the matter at hand. Regarding the capture or confirmed death of Gu Ming, the essence was actually about how to reconsolidate the family's power. Miss Wang-Chi didn't want Gu Ming to live, but if there was a choice, it was best to capture him alive. Taking him to Flying Wing Star for a public trial and execution would be ideal. However, this matter couldn't be forced. On one hand, firearms in battle don't have eyes. If he died, there was nothing that could be done. On the other hand, as long as Gu Ming was alive, there was an element of uncertainty. Taking him to Flying Wing Star, where Gu Ming still had a foundation, would possibly lead to unforeseen incidents. Arrest, detention, trial, execution, there were too many opportunities to manipulate the process. Once it entered into formal proceedings, some actions might become difficult. Better to directly deal with him on the battlefield than to have the situation change and to be forced to kill him in prison or under house arrest and carry a bad reputation. After all, it was Gu Ming who struck first. If he died, no one could say Gu Hang and his mother were cruel and ruthless. And as long as Gu Ming died, coupled with the fact that he instigated an armed disturbance and family coup, and given that Miss Wang-Chi herself received more support from Gu's Commerce Association, taking full control of the Gu family's power afterwards shouldn't be difficult. After Miss Wang-Chi shared her thoughts, she asked her son, "And what about you? What are your thoughts on Heijian Star?" Gu Hang showed a very sunny smile, "Mother, haven't you seen it already?" Chapter 426. What does Gu Hang think about Heijian Star? Of course, he has big plans for it. Initially, he sent Prabhuv to lead the expeditionary force here simply to protect his mother's safety and ensure a smooth transition of power within the Gu family. But now, an unexpected situation has arisen. He led an army in person and even committed interstellar warriors to come to the rescue, and the cost was very high. It was not just a military cost but also a significant economic and political cost. The Gu family suffered heavy losses after this battle. Over the past few days, not only was the ground warfare fierce, but within the space of Heijian Star, the two originally family-affiliated Chamber of Commerce fleets were almost at each other's throats. However, their conflict seemed a bit like a melee of incompetence. The main issue was that neither side comprised a proper navy. At best, they were armed merchant ships, described as escort ship or destroyer class, but in reality, they were about the same size and had inferior firepower, not to mention other aspects. Furthermore, during the early stages of the battle, nearly 100 ships under the control of Wang Qi erupted in minor mutinies, aside from the various transport starships that were devoid of fighting capability. At first, the fight between the two sides wasn't very intense. It wasn't until Wang Jiarong regrouped the fleet and launched a full-on attack that their battle really heated up. The opposition, with the help of planetary orbital firepower, was tenacious in defense. Even though they had fewer ships, they suffered fewer losses than Wang Jiarong's side. Wang Jiarong, however, ordered her fleet to attack ferociously, regardless of losses. In just a few days, the two sides had destroyed more than a dozen ships, and the intensity of the war was still escalating. Wang Jiarong was also in a state of desperation. Not only did she have a deep emotional connection with her aunt, but even from a self-interested perspective, as an outsider to the Gu family who rose to a high position by following her aunt and being her aunt's trusted confidant, Miss Wang Qi would be the second one to be purged if anything happened to her aunt. Although the naval battle seemed a bit like a fight among the weak, it was still fought with desperation. The brutal conflict only ceased when the Blade Tiger, flying the Navy's flag, forcefully ordered a ceasefire between the two sides. And by that time, the number of destroyed ships had already surpassed 20. Gu Heng's heart bled at this. These were all family assets that, if things had gone according to plan, would be resources available to him when he became the Gu clan leader in the future. Now, all of it was gone. And these were just the visible losses. Given the extent of the conflict and the extremity of resorting to armed force, Wang Qi would likely face many difficulties in cleaning up the aftermath and reintegrating the family's resources. Many of the family's past trade routes, relationships, and resources would suffer significantly. According to his mother, the family's assets would shrink by a conservative estimate of 40% after this battle. As for the political cost, that mainly comprised the promises Gu Heng made to the Pei Desi leadership on his way to rescue his mother. Following this ordeal, the Gu family's original plan to detach from the so-called Tianma Star Sector Iron Triangle and adopt a more neutral and cross-sector expansion was basically unachievable. After all the effort to ease relations and even begin large-scale purchases to make the 3 stars of the Fatches family a significant source of raw materials and market, that market would likely be lost. This was, after all, due to the execution of the Pei Desi leadership's blockade actions against the Fatches family. Of course, these challenges were primarily for Gu Heng's mother to face. But although the two parties couldn't yet be considered one, Gu Heng had come to regard the forces under Wang Qi control as firm allies of Rage Owl Star through their unwavering blood ties after multiple incidents. This alliance was highly reliable. The losses of the Gu clan were his father's losses. So, taking some compensation from Heijian Star to make up for the losses, that wouldn't be too much to ask for, right? So, what exactly do you want? Wang Qi posed this question. I want the Lumen Kingdom, Gu Heng said bluntly to his mother. The Lumen Kingdom is the 3rd largest country on Heijian Star, with a population of 4 million in a land area of 4.8 million square kilometers. I want it all. The Lumen Kingdom itself can exist, the Lumen family should no longer exist. Wang Qi frowned. What's the value in that? It's just an agricultural country. Their annual output is only over 20 million tax currency, yet they need to pay 4 million in imperial tax. After taxes, the amount left in the treasury barely exceeds 2 million. Of these 2 million, most of it must be spent on maintaining the army, plus some administrative expenses, royal household expenditures. It would be fortunate if the annual budget doesn't end up in deficit. What kind of profit can you gain from taking over such a place? Gu Heng shook his head and said, My mother, this is the difference between the thinking of a merchant and that of a builder. You only see the present value of an asset, yet you fail to see its future. Wang Qi, after the ordeal of this event, had improved her temper considerably. In the past, if her son spoke to her like this, how could she have tolerated it? But now, she could endure it, showing only a slight dissatisfaction. I'm not blind to the potential. But the premise of development is the investment of the necessary capital. 40 million population, over 4 million square kilometers of decent land, these are positive assets. However, the education level of Lumen Kingdom citizens, the level of industrialization, the standard of infrastructure are all extremely poor. How much resources will you need to invest to achieve the future you envision? And how many years before it pays off? Chapter 427. After a pause, Wang Qi continued, Moreover, this is just a simple economic calculation, and there are other factors that haven't been taken into account. Here we are on Heijian Star, which has an owner, which is governed by the King's Council. If you occupy the Lumen Kingdom, how will the other 6 kingdoms and a myriad of smaller states view this? How will you establish a legitimate rule? If the tensions escalate, is there a possibility of war breaking out? How many resources will you need to commit to dealing with these wars? Clearly, Wang Qi was skeptical about this. In the end, she offered her own suggestion: why not trade these battle gains for some tangible benefits? Population and land are tangible benefits. I mean more short-term, more direct ones. Gu Hang sighed. The biggest disagreement between him and his mother was exactly this. Merchants consider profits, investment returns, risks. But Gu Hang never considered himself a merchant. Pure profit was never his primary concern when making decisions. This included his decision to become the governor of Rage Owl Star. Speaking of which, Gu Hang said, when I was rebuilding Rage Owl Star, did I invest anything? Just with that rhetorical question, he had stumped Wang Qi. Indeed, the situation on Rage Owl Star was much worse than that of Heijian Star. According to what Wang Qi said, wouldn't Rage Owl Star be an even more negative asset? But what about the outcome? Even she could not deny the developmental state of Rage Owl Star with her eyes open. And all of this was built on the premise that Gu Hang started from scratch. She was well aware that, in the nearly 2 years' time, Gu Hang hadn't received a single penny of investment from the family. But even so, Rage Owl Star was already a thriving prospect. She did not know how her son had achieved this. She had tried to inquire indirectly, but never received a straightforward answer. But if the corresponding model could be replicated on Heijian Star, then what potential could the 40 million people of the Lumen Kingdom unleash? She couldn't help but ponder. And Gu Hang's words continued, of course, I won't treat this place as my homeland or as a core area for development. My energy and resources are limited, and I will give priority to Rage Owl Star. Furthermore, as you have said, Mother, taking control of the Lumen Kingdom will come with various obstacles and troubles. Here, I will merely treat it as a colony for the time being. But I will still invest a small amount of development resources. After all, given the current state of the Lumen Kingdom, whatever I do, it is all hollow, and squeezing it dry would yield but a trifle of oil. The real solution is to increase productivity and expand the economy as a whole. I have calculated the investment needed, and it won't be too high. Moreover, I will liberate the people, their current production relations are simply too primitive and backward. Wang Qi expressed her concerns: by doing this, you'll inevitably offend the other 6 feudal kingdoms, and there will be significant diplomatic issues. Images from history in his previous life flashed through Gu Hang's mind. Indeed, what would it look like to have a centralized state emerge among a group of feudal monarchies? You are right. However, there will soon be a major window of opportunity that can bring a period of peace. Wang Qi immediately furrowed her brows. She thought for a moment and understood what Gu Hang was talking about: imperial tax. Yes, Gu Hang said, if nothing unexpected happens, in at most another 2 or 3 months, the fleet of the Imperial Taxation Department will arrive at the Tianma Star sector. Wang Qi followed Gu Hang's train of thought and pondered, and now, the governor of Heijian Star is the king of the Lumen Kingdom, authorized by the King's Council and registered with the Empire's administrative department. This means that the entire planet's imperial tax is to be submitted through Ness Lumen. Theoretically, he still owns the entire planet. Right, Gu Hang said, once I've taken care of Gu Ming and Ness Lumen, you go clean up the family's mess, and I'll take care of the Heijian Star mess. I will reconvene the King's Council, affirm the Gu family's claim over the Lumen Kingdom, which is ownership of the entire Lumen Kingdom. I will hold in my grasp the governorship of the Lumen Kingdom for 2 more years, using the occasion of the imminent submission of the imperial tax. The other 6 nations won't be able to disagree, they've already sent their share of the imperial tax materials to the Lumen Kingdom in succession, they must compromise on this matter. The risk is still too high, Wang Qi said, you're right, at least before the imperial tax is submitted, no matter what you do, the other 6 nations won't make any significant moves. But 3 months later, once the imperial tax is submitted, they won't let you hold on to the planetary governor's powers, they will definitely reconvene the King's Council, elect a new governor, and you won't be able to get elected. Who agreed to them reconvening the King's Council? Gu Hang said. It's the tradition of Heijian Star. What do their traditions have to do with me? Gu Hang retorted, does the Empire acknowledge the traditions of Heijian Star? They do. No, wait. Wang Qi realized something. Does the Empire recognize the so-called King's Council traditions of Heijian Star? It depends on the perspective. Hagian Star changes its governor every 4 years. This governor is nominated by the King's Council from one of the 7 major nations' kings, reported to the Empire, accepted by the Empire, and then for those 4 years, tax collection is the governor's responsibility. From this angle, the Empire certainly recognizes it. The Empire's administrative department will respect the local traditions of the planet to some extent. If you want to change the governor, they will let you change. However, from another perspective, this does not conflict with the Empire's policies at all. The Empire collects taxes by keeping tabs on the governor. Whoever is the governor is who they go to. The same applies to all of the Empire's governance policies. They are also directed at the registered governor. Military aid, interstellar trade, it all follows the governor. Fundamentally, the Empire views the process of changing governors on Hagian Star as the incumbent governor resigning and nominating a new one, approved by the Star Sector government, then by the Star Domain government, and finally by the Empire's administrative department. It's just that because of the special circumstances of Hagian Star, the entire process goes very smoothly. But what if the incumbent governor doesn't resign within the process? What would happen if Gu Heng used the governorship authority acquired from Ness Lumen to stubbornly hold on to power? In the eyes of the Empire, there's no term limit for a governor. As long as you submit the tax every 2 years, you're the recognized governor by the Empire, anything else is none of their concern. In the history of Hagian Star, there have been more than one such occurrence. Those who clung to the governorship, if they were from a particularly strong nation at the time, the other nations would just hold their noses and bear it, endure beatings if they didn't, and ultimately still had to obediently comply. And if they weren't strong enough, then a war would break out. The strong nation clinging to the governorship, while satisfying the imperial tax requirements, would brutally punish the disobedient, through methods such as overthrowing royal authority, setting up puppets, and plundering territories, to affirm dominance. This is all brightly recorded in the history of Hagian Star. However, this kind of dominance usually didn't last very long. In the last 100 or 200 years, international affairs on Hagian Star have been relatively stable, the King's Council has played an important role, everyone obediently complied, and there wasn't much war over the struggle for governorship for dominance. Wang Qi sighed, "You're about to turn Hagian Star upside down." Gu Heng spread his hands innocently, they struck first. Chapter 428. Gu Heng and Wang Qi, this mother and son duo, discussed post-war plans in their conversation. No matter how much they disagreed or how worried Wang Qi was about her son's plans, there was one point they never talked about but took for granted as the premise for everything. Gu Ming and Ness Lumen were as good as dead. The reason they took this for granted was because neither of them saw it as an issue, but as a certainty. And reality proved that they were not being blindly arrogant. After the Phoenix Battle Group and the Allied Air Force executed a beautiful surprise attack, destroying a Night Titan, the Lumen Legion besieging the suburban town collapsed. It was also fortunate that the Phoenix did not have complete intelligence during the assault, unaware that Gu Ming and Ness Lumen were right beside the Night Titan they destroyed, allowing the two to escape. Otherwise, with the capabilities of the Phoenix, they could have easily slaughtered them on the spot. But they could only run temporarily, not forever. In the following days, several events transpired that symbolized the dissolution and collapse of their alliance. Moreover, these events happened quickly. First, the last Night Titan in the Lumen Kingdom's army was destroyed. After the defeat at the suburban town battlefield, as the main forces of the Allied reinforcements had yet to arrive, the Lumen military was trying hard to regroup and retreat towards Pincer City. However, at this time, a battalion of the 1st Extinguishing Wind Brigade as the vanguard and the first troops to disembark from the landing ships was already speeding toward the battlefield. The sight of the reassembled Lumen army's main force did intimidate this battalion. Although they had over 1,000 troops, with 9 Lion tanks and over 50 various types of combat vehicles, attacking the enemy's tens of thousands of troops, especially given the presence of over 100 scout mechas and a Night Titan in the enemy forces, was indeed difficult. If they charged in, they might not come back. After much deliberation, the battalion commander, a major, decided to play it safe. He instructed his troops to merely follow at a distance and monitor movements. In fact, the major was very tense inside. His battalion was too small in number, and being an armored mobile force, they couldn't dig any temporary lines of defense while keeping up with the enemy. If the enemy were to counterattack head-on, it would be a serious problem. Especially if the Night Titan began to move, that would be truly nerve-wracking. However, he quickly realized he had worried too much. The enemy's reaction was much more panicked than his own. When his armored troops appeared, the enemy was like startled birds, jumping into action. Through his military binoculars and the reports from his reconnaissance soldiers, he could see the enemy troops become utterly disorganized. The Night Titan he had dreaded even sped up and moved away from them. This was absurd to the Major. Forget his single battalion, the cost of that Night Titan was far more than his entire brigade combined. Yet, when the Titan noticed the presence of his battalion nearby, with plenty of other troops around, its first reaction was to accelerate away. Amidst his disbelief at the absurdity, a bold new idea popped into his mind. Why not go for it? The Lumen army was like a toothless tiger. It was as if their backbone had been broken. However, he was still rational and did not let the tempting thought directly sway him. But soon, another event catalyzed his idea and made up his mind. The Stellar Warriors and the Allied Air Force arrived. Military communications came straight into his command vehicle, and after a brief exchange, he made his decision. Oh, he didn't need to make the decision now. In the Allied military hierarchy, Commander Maddens of the Phoenix Battalion had very high authority. According to Allied military regulations, he was required to follow the battalion leader's command on the battlefield unless the leader's orders absolutely contradicted the mission he was carrying out, in which case he needed to seek higher clearance. Now, Commander Maddens simply wanted his surveillance troop to launch an attack and distract the enemy's attention, which didn't create a conflict with his tasks. The only thing of concern was casualties. But this was an absolute order for battle. Where did concerns about casualties come in? The battalion quickly prepared for combat and launched an attack. They were already in a state of combat readiness, not requiring any additional preparation, and could start fighting at the command. And the outcome of the battle? As expected, the Lumen people had no will to fight and were easily scattered like rats by the iron tide, fleeing in all directions. This was a crushing defeat. The actual number of casualties was not significant, as a single battalion couldn't really set up encirclements or execute annihilation tactics. However, their assault achieved its real effect. The Lumen people, whose morale had already collapsed after the defeat at the suburban town, managed to barely reassemble, only to show signs of collapsing again at this attack. Chapter 429. Of course, within this group, there were always some reliable presences. Those were the knights. Within the feudal legion, these knights, who served as middle-rank military officers and had been carefully raised since childhood, maintained decent combat will. Under the command and perseverance of these knights, the assault by the composite camp inevitably began to slow down, gradually showing signs of becoming bogged down. After all, their force was a little too small. The Night Titan had reacted as well. It stopped fleeing and started using long-range firepower to strike at the Alliance army. Casualties began to emerge. But it was at this moment that the Phoenix appeared. The characteristic roaring sound of the Wind Falcon arrived first. Their initial position was at least 100 kilometers away, but within 15 minutes after the battle had started, they had reached the battlefield. Without missiles having used up their missile payloads in the previous combat in the suburbs, there was no chance to resupply at the moment. However, the onboard laser cannons and the real single cannons still produced very powerful effects. After a round of ground scheming fire, the Lumen army became even more disorganized. The starfighters, too, descended from the sky. They repeated the same old trick. 3 Wind Falcons performed a stunt. They lowered their altitude to just over 10 meters and slightly reduced their flying speed while firing fiercely at their surroundings. At the same time, the hatches opened, and the starfighters jumped down one by one. However, one should never underestimate any enemy, right? Some of the knights piloting Sentinel mechas had experienced the combat in the suburbs. As the characteristic sound of the Wind Falcons appeared overhead, some brave souls among them raised their gun barrels and fired at the Wind Falcons. Most shots missed. The swiftly streaking Wind Falcons were not so easily hit. But the 3 Wind Falcons carrying the Phoenix faced trouble. Their lower altitude and reduced flight speed increased their risk significantly. One of them, while deploying the starfighters, was hit by continuous machine gun fire, taking hits to its wing. The entire Wind Falcon tumbled down, crashing hard on the ground, smashing the Sentinel mecha that had shot it down in the process. The morale of the surrounding Lumen warriors briefly soared. Taking down a plane, especially one carrying the formidable starfighters, was a feat. However, this surge in morale was short-lived because it was quickly replaced by panic once more. Not to mention the 10 starfighters who had landed successfully, even the slightly deformed hatch of the downed Wind Falcon was suddenly kicked open from the inside. A starfighter burst out, his grenade gun firing violently, eliminating the threatening targets around him. Of course, the so-called threat was not that menacing. In fact, when the Lumen people saw starfighters emerging unscathed from the wrecked flyer, the only thing on their minds was to run. Subsequently, more starfighters emerged, forming a 5-man squad. In the event of the Wind Falcon crash, all 5 starfighters survived without any serious injuries, each retaining their combat capability. However, the crash had still delayed them somewhat. Their combat brothers had already charged toward the nearby Night Titan. Thus, there was no need for these 5 to join the charge. They raised their weapons and started clearing the surrounding enemies, mainly focusing on those sentinel mechas with stronger resistance. Meanwhile, they didn't neglect their primary target and, unsurprisingly, they witnessed the swift process of their commander eliminating the Night Titan. The most important defense of Night Titan is the shield generator it is equipped with, which is ineffective against interstellar warriors unless they foolishly choose to strike only with ranged weapons. The shield's inability to recognize slow-moving targets allows interstellar warriors to walk through the energy shields and attack directly with cold weapons. Having a shield generator or not doesn't make much of a difference in such a case. Of course, Night Titan itself also has thick armor. Unfortunately for it, Maddens had a power sword in his hand. In front of such a weapon that can decompose matter, ordinary armor is no better than papier-mâché. Just like how he had dismantled that Night Titan in the suburbs earlier, he did the same now. And when this Night Titan crashed to the ground, the already crumbling Lumen army collapsed completely. Not only the ordinary Lumen soldiers but even the Knights piloting Sentinel mechas lost their will to fight. This also made the retreat of the interstellar warriors much smoother, as they easily joined forces with the composite camp that had extricated itself from the mire, and retreated without difficulty. On the road from the suburb town to Pincer City, the ground was littered with the corpses of Lumen people. Unfortunately, the main force that came to support didn't unload quickly enough, and many were still crushing the troops sent to intercept them in a tidal wave of steel. Thus, they failed to engage in a beautiful encirclement battle outside of Pincer City while the enemy was in disarray. The Alliance's forces could only use small-scale wolf pack tactics, constantly biting chunks of flesh off these disintegrating troops. Despite having caused significant casualties to the enemy's living force and forcing a considerable number of Lumen people to desert, in the end, they still let about 20,000 people enter the city. While the number might seem significant, in reality, more than 80% of the enemy was either dead or fled, no longer organized or a threat. Moreover, most of those who had fled back to Pincer City were common soldiers. The Lumen Kingdom's main military force might still exist in name, but in reality, it was finished. This country, with a population of 40 million, supported an army of about 500,000, but most were under the feudal lord's control. The core of the force consisted of about 600 knights, and at the top were 6 ranger-level Night Titans supported by national resources. In the political ecology of the Lumen Kingdom, there were 2 great dukes, each possessing a Night Titan and with more than 200 knights swearing allegiance to them. Although they were vassals of the kingdom, they had a relatively high degree of independence. The most core forces at the disposal of King Ness Lumen were known as the Royal Knight Order, consisting of 200 Royal Knights plus 2 Ranger-level Titans, plus 2 Earls who were directly loyal to the royal family and their vassals, that's another 200 Knights and 2 Titans. These constituted the overall military force of the Lumen Kingdom. Right from the start, Ness Lumen had almost mobilized all his military forces. The gathering of common soldiers was not much, about 150,000, but the 400 Knights and 4 Titans were summoned ahead of time in the name of a festival. This was virtually all his base being put into play. And then, all was lost. The most painful, of course, was the loss of the 4 Night Titans. The damage can't be viewed solely by the production cost of 700,000 tax currency. The maintenance costs of these behemoths were over 100,000 tax currency each time, and they needed maintenance every 2 to 3 years, or else their combat effectiveness would suffer. Over the years, Lumen Kingdom had spent untold amounts of money on them. Now, all was lost. And of those 400 knights piloting Sentinel mechas, fewer than 50 returned. In the political ecology of the Lumen Kingdom, those knights were the mid-level rulers, the Titans were the high-level rulers. After a decisive roundup, not only was the military force nearly wiped out, but the kingdom's political ecology was also destroyed, leaving nothing behind. In this sense, even if the alliance suddenly had a change of heart, stopped their offensive, withdrew their forces, and demanded no indemnity, the Lumen Kingdom would likely cease to exist. The other 6 nations on Hagian Star would not miss the chance to take over such a weakened Lumen, even the 2 remaining dukes, whose power hadn't suffered much, might also have some plans in mind. And, of course, Gu Heng would not be so kind-hearted. The army approached the city. The reorganized alliance army surrounded Pincer City. Chapter 430. Prabhupada gazed at the city before him, his expression serene. Leroy approached his side. Prabhupada turned to look at his old partner, whose one ear was wrapped in bandages that were still seeping blood. The ear of his political commissar, Colonel Leroy, would be deaf forever. Yet, Leroy himself didn't seem to mind it, his face still wearing a smile. He turned to Prabhupada and asked, "What's wrong with you? You've just been promoted, yet you look so grim." He was referring to Prabhupada being confirmed once again as the commander of the Alliance Expeditionary Force. Although the governor had come in person, he had not interfered with military command, which was still entrusted to Prabhupada. Moreover, although his military rank hadn't changed yet, the governor had made it clear that once they returned, he would be promoted to the formal rank of Major General. Logically, this was a joyous event. Prabhupada had long coveted the title of general. But when it was finally within his grasp, he felt as if he wasn't that happy. Faced with his old friend's question, he sighed deeply, "I have never lost so many men under my command." That single statement silenced Leroy as well. Together, they remembered the scene when they set off from Rage Owl Star with the expeditionary force. Those young and spirited faces, full of pride and valor as they boarded the spacecraft. And now? The 34th, 37th, and 38th divisions were now crippled. The loss of personnel exceeded 50% and losses of armored vehicles and artillery surpassed 70%. Among the survivors, most were wounded. Even if they resupplied ammunition, these three divisions had little fighting strength left. In the 8 days of desperate, bloody defending that preceded, they had made enormous sacrifices. Toward the end, it didn't matter if they were front-line combat units or not engineer battalions, logistics camps, guard companies, they were all pulled into the fight. To restore these three divisions to fighting strength would be almost equivalent to rebuilding them. Since the establishment of the alliance, the two largest operations had been the pacification of the Green Valley region and the eastern provinces. Leroy and Prabhupada had participated in both. In those wars, the alliance had always been the advantaged side. They had never encountered a battle that crippled three divisions. The brutal sacrifices were etched deeply into the hearts of these two military leaders. But what could Leroy say? In war, aren't there always casualties? The merciful cannot lead an army. He simply reminded Prabhupada with this saying. That saying was an ancient Gutara sentiment he had heard from the governor. Prabhupada nodded, "I understand. I'm just wondering, in those days, could we have done better? Could we have saved more lives?" Leroy patted his good friend's shoulder and comforted him, "What's past is beyond changing. What we can do is perform better in the future." Now, the newly arrived 1st Extinguishing Wind Brigade, 2nd Infantry Division, 13th Combined Brigade, and 36th Combined Brigade are all under your command. You're still the commander of the Expeditionary Force. We cannot let down the soldiers' sacrifices, nor can we fail the governor's trust. Yet. Prabhupada nodded again, and asked, "What about that thing we discussed earlier? How is that coming along?" "The governor has agreed," Leroy said. "The 34th, 37th, and 38th divisions will certainly be rebuilt upon their return and won't be disbanded or merged into other units. Moreover, they will be awarded commendations and honorary designations as meritorious units. That puts my mind at ease." "You needn't have worried about that anyway," Leroy asserted. "Such things are part of a unit's historical heritage, a part of its essence. Even leaving aside these symbolic aspects, practically speaking, they can serve as internal propaganda, part of the military legacy, so that new warriors joining these meritorious units will quickly develop a sense of pride after learning their history, and this will greatly boost morale and esprit de corps. It's better to rebuild these units than dismantle them." Prabhupada showed an embarrassed smile. "I was just worried, just in case." "You'd better focus on the matter at hand," Leroy advised. "We have to take this city with finesse." "I already have some ideas," Prabhupada said. "You can take a look with me." He began to explain the battle plan in detail to his political commissar. The wounded soldiers from the 34th, 37th, and 38th divisions were left in the suburban towns, and the remaining few thousand troops were integrated into a force barely enough for 2 infantry regiments. They were positioned directly in front of the north gate of Pincer City, 20 kilometers away, where they established a position and began shelling the city with artillery. Of course, the main assault operation did not require the already heavily sacrificed troops. They were mainly a diversion, while the main effort was to be shouldered by the 4 newly arrived divisions. The Extinguishing Wind Brigade on the east, the 13th and 36th Brigades on the west. These 3 combined brigades would be the primary attacking force. They would use armor and heavy artillery to break open the gates of Pincer City. The 2nd Infantry Division was positioned directly south of Pincer City. In addition to blocking the city's southern part, they had another task, which was to watch over the 2 great marquises of the Lumen Kingdom to the south of the royal city. The movements of those so-called marquises are a significant unknown. Leroy expressed his concerns. If they're determined to assemble their forces to interfere with our operations, they'll have 2 Night Titans, over 200 Mecha Sentinels, and up to 200,000 infantry that they could potentially muster. Although those Lumen infantry are mostly ragtag cannon fodder, their numbers are substantial, and we cannot completely ignore them.